Do you want a crash course about your grains, the history of them, what they're good for, what they're used for, all of those things? Well, buckle up, Buttercup. Grab you some coffee and a notepad because we're going to be diving in today. Hey y'all, welcome back to Grains and Grit. My name is Felicia, and on this channel, we talk all things real whole grains from a biblical perspective. I teach you how to be milling your wheat, baking bread, all the things with all the grains. So if you've been around for a while, you may have noticed that in 2024, we did a challenge for the whole year. It was our Grains Explorer Challenge, where each and every month we explored a different grain and really dove into what this grain was about, how we can be using it, challenging ourselves to be using it in our kitchen for that month. And I figured, why not combine all the videos for 2024 and put them in this one marathon video, so that way you can get a very thorough education about 12 different grains, and some of them you may have never heard of. So be sure to grab some coffee. My favorite is 7 Weeks Coffee or Verena Street. I have coupon codes for you below. And also grab a notepad because you may want to take some notes and learn some things about some fascinating grains that God has given us. Do know timestamps will be below if you're curious about just a specific grain. And I would like for you to comment below and give me your feedback. Let me know which one's your favorite grain, which ones maybe have you not heard of, which ones are you curious to try yourself, you know, just anything and everything. I want to hear about it from y'all. So without further ado, let's get to this marathon. Welcome to 2024, which means we are kicking off the brand new challenge that we are doing here at Grains and Grit, the Grains Explorer Challenge for 2024. And what better way to kick it off than to start with an ancient of grains, barley. Hey y'all, welcome back to Grains and Grit. My name is Felicia, and on this channel we talk all things real whole grains from a biblical perspective. I teach you how to mill those grains, baking the bread from scratch, incorporating real whole grains into your life, and most importantly about the daily bread that Jesus told us to be praying for. As I mentioned, this is the first video of our new challenge, the Grains Explorer Challenge. So you may have participated in the Make Bread 365 Challenge for 2023. And this is similar, but instead of focusing on a bread each month, we are focusing on a specific grain each month and all the wonderful recipes that can come from that one grain. This is not your typical grains. We're going to be challenging ourselves and exploring new grains that you may have not heard of or even tried. So each month I will be doing here on YouTube a Meet the Grain video. I will be introducing this grain to you, what it's good for, all the details. But for the full adventure for the Grains Explorer Challenge, you need to be checking out the Grainy Bunch and all my wonderful grainies over there. That is our exclusive supporter group for Grains and Grit, and they will have the full adventure experience with the Grains Explorer Challenge. For those of us who are diehard grainies in the Grainy Bunch, you will be getting extra recipes, extra videos, including a bonus video where I teach you an actual whole meal incorporating whatever grain we're doing this month. On top of that, there are normal advantages of being a member of the Grainy Bunch. So for all the wonderful details with our Grains Explorer Challenge, all you got to do is head on over to grainsandgrit.com/grainsexplorer, and that'll also give you the details about the Grainy Bunch as well, sign up, so on and so forth. Okay, so January 2024 for our Grains Explorer Challenge, we are going to be talking about barley, which you have probably heard of, but maybe not really familiar with this absolutely fascinating grain. So in this video, we're going to be discussing the history of barley, the different types of barley, and there's like 7, what type of barley you should be using, the health benefits of barley, and of course, what to use barley for. So first up, the fascinating history about barley. When I say it's an ancient of ancient grains, it really is. Many people, when you hear ancient grains, you think of Einkorn, Kamut, Spelt, but most people don't ever even mention barley as an ancient grain. But it is not only one of the first cultivated grains that humans were cultivating when we started with agriculture, which, by the way, was right after the fall. We have been farmers ever since, but that's a different video. But when we look at the Bible, this is actually specifically mentioned by name, where we do see wheat a lot used in the Bible, but it does not specifically state emmer, kamut, spelt, einkorn, but it does specifically mention barley many, many times, and it has a lot of significance in the Bible. First mention we hear of barley is in Deuteronomy 9, where Moses is with Pharaoh, and it's the whole "let my people go" thing. And we specifically see barley mentioned for the first time in our King James Bible in Deuteronomy 9, when it talks about after the plague with the hail mixed with fire, that it specifically talks about the flax and the barley being harmed. Specifically in verse 31 of chapter 9, it says that the flax and barley was smitten. So there we have it, barley right there in ancient Egypt, very early on in the Bible. And sorry, I mentioned Deuteronomy, I meant Exodus. So there we see it, second book of the Bible, and we have barley mentioned, and we have had it ever since. We also see it as one of the foods mentioned in Deuteronomy 8, talking about the foods of the promised land, along with olive oil and honey and wheat. It talks about wheat and barley specifically. We also see it as one of the foods used in Levitical sacrifices. And then we also see it where it's kind of used as a currency, and in other cultures it was used as a type of currency. It specifically talks about in the Bible how an ephah of barley equals so many shekels. On top of the Bible, archaeologists were able to see this in many other type of ancient cultures. It is one of those grains that it is seen pretty much throughout the world. Over in Asia, we see it in China, we see it in Finland. Of course, ancient Rome used it. I mean, it is just one of those grains that we've known about for a long time. Now let's fast forward to modern times and what barley is generally used for today and how it fits in our modern world. Now, a lot of people know of barley in two ways, one for animal feed and then also in beer. So crazy enough today is that it is actually the fourth largest grain that is cultivated behind wheat, rice, and corn. So you have wheat, rice, corn, barley. And as of 2020, Russia was actually the main producer of barley. So nowadays, we do not consume barley as a regular part of our diet, at least here in the United States. 70% of barley now is actually mainly used for animal fodder. The other 30% is used in fermented type goods like beer, whiskey, and then just consumed as normal. But where it used to be a huge part of people's diet, not so much anymore. Now, in case you're interested, where it likes to be grown is it likes to be grown in more temperate type climates in the summer and more tropical climates in the winter. It does fine in cooler environments, but not a winter hardy crop. So if you are interested in being extra and growing your own barley, that is something to consider. In the United States, half of barley is actually produced for livestock feed, especially in the northern climates. I think in the South, a lot of ours is corn, where up north, where barley is mainly grown, barley is typically used. And fun fact, in Western Canada, so for my Canadian viewers, Western Canadian beef, it is actually marketed that they are generally barley finished, meaning whether they were on grain or grass, they like to be finished off with barley right before being processed for beef. And that actually is what gives them a very distinct flavor. So again, it's a fascinating grain, absolutely fascinating grain when you really look at the history, and to know that we are pretty much eating the same grain today that has been here pretty much the whole time. It truly is a wonderful connection with pretty much all of our ancestors, no matter which country you're from. Now, another side note that I did not mention is barley is not a gluten-free grain. It does contain gluten, just like wheat and other grains like that. So do keep that in mind. We're going to take a quick moment to thank the sponsor of today's video. This is a new sponsor, 4Generations Organic Farms. Personally, I love ordering straight from the fields that my wheat berries come from. They are organic farmers, which means that they believe in regenerative farming, and they rotate their crops, and they even give their soil a rest to ensure maximum nutrition. They have actually been on the same family plot since the 1800s in Oklahoma. They of course offer many different sizes, ranging from 5-pound burlap sacks all the way up to 5-gallon buckets, which are sealed with oxygen absorbers. They've actually cultivated their own wheat berries. So even though you are buying hard red, hard white wheat berries from them, it's their own strand. So those unique flavors are going to be coming out in your bread. And another cool fact about them, they supply wheat berries to King Arthur flour, which I know is a big one, as well as other major organic flour brands. So good news for us home millers, we can completely cut out the middleman and just buy those wheat berries straight from the farmer themselves and mill it into delicious whole grain bread. So to check out 4Generations Organic Farms, just go to grainsandgrit.com/4 generations, and just enter in grains and grit for the coupon code to receive 10% off your first order. So now let's talk about the types of barley that you can find on the market. So there are actually 7 types of barley type food that you can purchase. Of course, the first one is hulled barley. That's where we're going to hang out. That is what we have here. It's basically the equivalent to, the wheat berries that we are getting. It is barley where the hull has been removed. Now, do know if you're buying animal feed, barley, a lot of it still has the hull on, so something to consider. So you're actually looking for hulled barley, and that's what we're using. This is what we throw into our grain mills. It can be milled up just like wheat. It looks a lot like wheat, which is why we label everything very well. So that's where we're hanging out with for this challenge, is hulled barley. It's the whole grain version of barley, where it has your germ and your bran. It's just the inedible hull that it grows in that has been removed. The second one that you can possibly find is actually hull-less barley. So pretty much the same thing. The only difference is that it's actually a genetic difference in when it's grown. Typically when barley is grown, the hull is very closely attached to the barley, where hull is loose. So the hull generally just falls off in normal harvesting. So it is definitely still a whole grain form, just the hull has been removed. It's just a looser hull. So if you find hull-less barley, it's the same stuff pretty much as hulled, just a different variety that makes it easier in harvesting. The third one you can find is barley grits, and all that is just what it says, where it's barley that has been cut up and is now used in like a grit type format. From what I can tell, it's I think it's more like steel cut oats, where they're taking the barley, just chopping it up. So I think more like steel cut oats, not grits, but that's a minor distinguishment in my southern brain. So that's what that is. Now, do know if you find barley grits, read the back of the label, because some are made from pearled barley, which is not a whole grain, and some are made from hulled barley, which is the whole grain form, which we'll get into pearled barley in a bit. Number 4, we have barley flakes. As it sounds like, it is basically rolled out version of barley, where we roll out. Typically they are steamed first and then they are rolled out flat. Very similar to how we do the rolled oats. And then of course we have barley flour that you can buy. Obvious barley that's been milled into flour. Done deal. I'm not really sure if that's truly a whole grain. That was kind of difficult to find information about. So be sure to read the label and check it out. But of course, we should be milling our own. You should not be buying barley flour. You should be milling your own. All right, next up, we have pearled barley, which is the most common. This is actually something that you can find in some grocery stores. And pearled barley is basically like the white rice version of barley. It's the white flour of barley. It's where barley grain has basically had the bran removed. It is polished or pearled. You have a barley that is not a true whole grain. About 40% of that bran and germ has been removed, and you have that equivalent that it actually cooks faster. So many recipes online I find that call for barley. A lot of them say pearled barley. You can for most of them substitute a whole barley just fine, but just know whole barley, like brown rice, takes longer to cook than pearled barley or white rice. Now, I will say this in slight defense of pearled barley, because of how barley is. It's unlike wheat berry. When we make wheat berry and we mill it and then we remove the bran and germ and we make white flour, that means the nutrients and the fiber has been removed from wheat. That is actually not the case when it comes to barley, because with barley, the fiber is throughout the kernel of barley. So pearled barley still retains a lot, if not all, of the fiber of barley, but the other nutrients have been removed. And with pearled barley, depending on how white it is, some bran may still be left behind. So something to consider, you at least still get the fiber of pearled barley, but you should still be using whole barley to get that true whole grain barley. All right, and then number 7 is you have quick pearled barley. Quick pearled barley is pearled barley that has been partially cooked and then dried. So it's now like instant rice, where now it cooks even faster in about 5 to 10 minutes because it's already been slightly cooked. But again, that's pearled barley that's been slightly cooked. So I would definitely just avoid that altogether. As always, read the labels, especially when you're looking at, say barley grits. If you're interested in that, just make sure if you're wanting true whole grain that it's made with whole barley and not the pearled barley. Those are the 2 main ones that you're going to see on the market. And again, all the recipes, everything that we're focused on for our Grains Explorer Challenge is going to be with whole barley. So now let's talk about the health benefits of barley. Now the beauty is it's a whole grain. And because it's a whole grain, you get many of your typical benefits with whole grains. That means you have a good amount of fiber, both insoluble and soluble fiber. And then it's also really great for iron, calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, zinc, potassium, niacin, vitamin B6, those type of B vitamins. So the benefits of whole grains that we see all the time is the main one they talk about is an excellent source of fiber and that it's good for your heart as well. So like I say here on this channel, whole grains are best and we need to stick with whole grains because of all the benefits. And this is what God created us to eat in the first place. So let's just stick to the closest thing God created for us to eat. So what is it good for? What do you use barley? You have some whole barley. Now what do we use it for? And it's actually used for many things. One of the big things that I see is that it's an excellent substitution for rice. And that's even for brown rice. For those of you who are diabetic or need to watch your sugar levels, whole barley is actually lower on the glycemic index than brown rice. So if you're really wanting to watch it, this is an excellent substitute for brown rice. So if you like chicken and rice soup, instead of using the rice, use some barley. Again, this cooks very similar to brown rice. If you know how to cook brown rice, this is very similar. Still takes about 40 to 50 minutes on the stovetop to cook. Soaking it first helps it cook a bit faster. That is a huge thing to consider because I know many of y'all talk about that you're diabetic or someone that you know is diabetic. So this is an excellent grain to use in replacement of rice. It is also excellent to just throw into soups, to stews, all of those things. We hear about like the Roman barley type stew that was given to the gladiators of ancient Roman times. We see it in stews. A lot of people like using it there. You can also just make a porridge from it, just like with any wheat berry, any type of whole grain. You can just boil it down, have it with whatever seasoning you like to have. It's just an easy peasy way to do it. No mill required. Surprisingly though, barley is excellent to use in cakes and cookies. So do you know that by itself as a bread, if you're making barley bread, this does not have a high enough gluten content to get you a nice loaf. So barley, if you're making barley bread, you usually have to mix it in with a hard wheat for all those who are milling ourselves in order to give it that structure for a good barley bread. So it can be used in breads, but because of that, it is a lighter, softer wheat. And so you can use it in cookies and even in cakes. In fact, I've actually seen a recipe from Sue Becker in her Homegrown Flour book, as well as from Michael Gropp. I've interviewed Michael here on this channel. She uses whole grains, and both of them actually have cookie recipes using barley. I haven't tried it out myself personally, but I do plan on to this month. And so surprisingly, you can use it in those type of baked goods. It has a nice soft texture, but still has a bit of a nutty flavor to it. So there you go. You have met barley. So again, this is our first one of our Grains Explorer Challenge. You have met the grain, and I am so excited for this challenge because it's definitely going to be a challenge for me as well to get me out of my comfort zone, to explore these grains that I'm not familiar with. So I hope to see you in the Grainy Bunch so we can talk shop there. And grainsandgrit.com/grainsexplorer to check out all the details with this challenge, to see what grains we're going to be using, and to sign up for the Grainy Bunch for the full adventure. As always, I hope y'all have a wonderful day, and here's to 2024, and I'll see you next week. Bye. It's another video for our Grains Explorer Challenge for 2024. And for February, our grain that we will be focusing on and exploring is sorghum. Hey y'all, welcome back to Grains and Grit. My name is Felicia, and on this channel, we talk all the things real whole grains from a biblical perspective. So as mentioned, this video is kind of a meet the grain to introduce the grain that we are doing for the month of February that we're exploring for our Grains Explorer Challenge. And if you're not sure what that is, it is a challenge that we are doing on this channel for 2024. So each month I'll be introducing a grain and we'll be focusing on that for that month. So challenge yourself to actually use these grains. And on the first Friday of every month is whenever a video comes out introducing you to the grain that month. Anyone can follow along, but for the full adventure with a guide, extra recipes, extra videos, and a huge community of fellow grainies, be sure to join the Grainy Bunch in order to have the full adventure for yourself. So for all the details about the Grains Explorer Challenge and even to join the Grainy Bunch, just go to grainsandgrit.com/grainsexplorer for all those details. Some of y'all may be familiar with sorghum because it's become a bit popular in for those who are following a gluten-free diet, because sorghum is a gluten-free grain with many, many benefits. Or maybe you've only heard of sorghum in regards to sorghum syrup. Well, do know it actually is a grain, and we'll be exploring that today. So what we'll cover about sorghum is we're going to do a general overview about sorghum and its history, nutritional benefits, what sorghum is used for, the different types of sorghum that you can find and buy, and then of course, kind of an overview of how to use sorghum in your own kitchen. So first up, let's talk about the history and an overview of sorghum. Sorghum is believed to be one of the first domesticated grains. It originates, and archaeologists believe, about 5,000 years ago in what we know as modern-day Sudan. It was actually the staple grain for the kingdom of Alodia, I believe is how it's pronounced, which was founded sometime after the kingdom of Kush. If you're a CC parent, you probably just had the Kush Assyrians. You know. So the kingdom of Kush fell around 350 AD is when this empire rose. And then after that, that's where archaeologists have found evidence of sorghum being that long ago. And then we believe that it went from Africa, spread up into India and China, and then into Australia. First known record of sorghum in the United States may actually surprise you. It actually comes from Benjamin Franklin in 1757, who wrote about its application in broom production. So as I mentioned, it is an ancient grain, but it's also a naturally occurring gluten-free grain as well. It's actually the fifth most produced grain in the world, with the United States being the top producer. In fact, we have what's called the sorghum belt here in the United States that consists of Kansas, Texas, Colorado, Oklahoma, and South Dakota, Kansas being the #1 producer of sorghum. It is known, it's praised for being a sustainable crop and good for the environment, and that is because that it is, when used for feed, every bit of it is actually used. It's drought resistant and able to be grown in harsh conditions where many other plants would fail. And its versatility and flexibility makes it not only available in the food and the feed industry, but also in other industries as well, like building materials and packing peanuts and many other places. Now, back in the 1960s, sorghum was really threatened by mildew and other diseases that I'm not even going to try to pronounce. But fortunately, scientists were able to produce a hybridization of sorghum to help combat these diseases. And let us pause there for a second. Yes, I said sorghum is hybridized. I'm here to wait for all the wheat belly people, the anti-wheat people, to now freak out about sorghum being hybridized. I'll wait. Nobody? Okay, moving on. Again, if you're not sure if hybridization is good for us, I've done a video for you. I'll link it up here. Last but not least, it is also a non-GMO grain. There is no genetically modified sorghum or anything like that. So it is gluten-free, an ancient grain. It has been hybridized like everything. And surprisingly, the United States is one of the top producers of it. Pretty cool, eh? All right, next up is the nutritional benefit of sorghum. So on top of the typical whole grain benefits like high in B vitamins, magnesium, iron, phosphorus, potassium, as well as fiber, so long as it's in its whole grain form, it is actually really high in antioxidants. And it's actually high in protein for a grain. So about the fiber, to kind of give you an idea, half cup of cooked sorghum provides about 7 grams of fiber, which is 25% of the daily recommended dose. So an excellent way, again, to get in fiber, as is most whole grains in its whole form. But what it surprised me was actually that it was high in protein, comparable to quinoa, which is another grain we will be exploring in the Grains Explorer Challenge this year. A half cup of cooked sorghum, which isn't that much, actually contains a whopping 11 grams of protein. And if you're not sure how much that is, 1 large egg equals 6 grams of protein. So for a little bit of this grain, you can get the equivalent of 2 eggs in protein. So if you're wanting to increase your amount of protein, but you love whole grains, or even plant-based, and you're looking for a higher plant-based food that's high in protein, this is a good one to use. And of course, another nutritional benefit is the fact that it is gluten-free, so it is safe for those with celiac disease or any other gluten allergy or gluten intolerance to be able to eat, and no problem there. Number 3, what sorghum is used for, and this actually surprised me when I was doing the research about this grain. So basically what it's used for is the 4 big F's: food, feed, fodder, and fuel. Yes, fuel. Crazy enough, 30 to 40% of the United States sorghum production is actually used for ethanol. And the reason why this is praised is because it produces the same amount of ethanol per bushel of sorghum as other grains that are used, but it uses 1/3 less water. So it's a little bit better for the environment that way. The second thing that it's used for is for food. Obviously, you can eat it. Moving on. Third that it's used for is for feed. So it is actually very prominent in animal feed, be it dairy animals, cattle, swine, poultry, and it's also used for pet food as well, like dogs and fish, etc. And it's also used for fodder. This is actually the stems and foliage are used for things like hay and various things like that. So that's what makes it such a great crop to grow, is because the entire plant can actually be used for all the different things. All right, next up, types of sorghum sold, as in if you were to go buy sorghum, what are your options out there? So like quinoa, it actually comes in many different colors, but every color kind of has its own usage. So it comes in white, tan, orange, red, bronze, and black varieties. Now here's how that actually breaks down and how they're typically used. Red, orange, and bronze sorghum is versatile enough to be used from animal feed all the way to regular human food, and even to fuel. tan, cream, and white grain tends to be ground up and used for sorghum flour for the food industry. Burgundy and black sorghum are actually the highest in their antioxidants. Now, a newer variety that was developed by Texas A&M is actually onyx sorghum. It's related to the ancient black and high tannin sorghum varieties, and it's designed to be super high in antioxidants. So that was another fun fact there, is the different colors kind of varies on how they're used in our markets today. Now, let's see what's actually used in recipes. So first of all, you have the whole grain sorghum that has the bran, the germ, the endosperm. It is the whole grain sorghum. Do you know this is the type that we will be using for our Grains Explorer Challenge? It's your typical whole grain sorghum. You also, like barley, have a pearled sorghum. And just like barley, that means that it's been stripped of its bran and some of its germ. And then finally, y'all probably heard it before, sorghum syrup. It comes from the stalks of sweet sorghum that is grown, and it is a sweetener that is very similar to molasses. In fact, if you have a recipe that calls for molasses, but you're wanting to use sorghum syrup, it generally can be substituted, a 1-to-1 substitute. Again, what we're using for the Grains Explorer Challenge is the whole grain sorghum. It can be found on Amazon. Azure Standard, I've been told, now has it back in stock. Whenever I was buying it, they did not have it in stock. And you may actually be able to find it at your local grocery store, the same aisle as the quinoa and the bulgur wheat. Now, last but not least, how to use sorghum. Again, all the extra specific recipes, videos, all those things will be available to the Grainy Bunch. So y'all be sure to be checking that out if you're my grainies. But I'm going to give you a few ideas to get you started on this challenge. First of all, sorghum can just be used as a replacement for rice or quinoa. You just boil it up and then you can pop your mashed potatoes or gravy or whatever it is that you like. Just treat it as you would rice or quinoa, and sorghum can be used instead. You, of course, can also mill it into your own flour. It's actually very common to find sorghum in gluten-free flour mixes. And for those of you who have Sue Becker's Home Ground Flour Cookbook, there actually is a gluten-free mix recipe in there that you can actually mill yourself. So for those of you, if for whatever reason you are wanting or needing to be gluten-free, I do recommend to make your own gluten-free mix by milling those grains yourself for the maximum benefit. So her cookbook actually does have a recipe using sorghum among other grains to make a gluten-free flour mix. Now, you also can try to substitute sorghum in some of your recipes, usually a 1-to-1 ratio when it's calling for a wheat flour. Just know, being a gluten-free grain, it does not have that binding agent that gluten gives you. That's why it usually has to be combined with something like xanthan gum or cornstarch. So be mindful of that. I would maybe start with muffins, things like that. Again, I am pre-recording this before I've actually experimented myself to kind of get ahead. So I experiment with you guys. I'm walking this journey with y'all. Now, the surprising thing about sorghum is you can actually pop it like popcorn, which is crazy. I'm so excited to try because I love popcorn, and I'm excited to actually pop sorghum myself to actually see how easy it is. Usually you just do it like you pop popcorn on the stovetop. So if you know how to do that, pop it. It is smaller. I do know that Azure Standard actually sells popped sorghum, and it's popped sorghum in its whole grain form. I've looked at the ingredients, so you can check that out as well, or just do it yourself at home. But how cool is that? And it's more nutritional and maybe even be easier on the stomach than typical popcorn. And last but not least, you can flake sorghum just like you do barley or oats, and then you can use that in making your own type of hot cereal, like equivalent to oatmeal, or throw it in your special granola recipe. So there you go. You have been introduced to sorghum. Again, I just love researching all of these grains. This has been such a great challenge for me to get out of my comfort zone because I've literally had sorghum on my shelf for a while and I've never once used it. So I will definitely be having fun experimenting this month with this grain, and I hope you do too. Again, if you ever post any recipes or anything like that on social media, be sure to tag me and use the hashtag Grains Explorer so I can see your wonderful creations. If you have been following us thus far on a Grains Explorer Challenge, let me know how it's going in the comments below, and be sure to check out here for the playlist so you can jump in at any time during this year in 2024 to jump in and challenge yourself to explore new grains. As always, I hope y'all have a wonderful day, and I will talk to y'all next week. Bye. It's March, which means we get to meet a new grain for our Grains Explorer Challenge. And this month, it is all about rice, a really big topic. Hey y'all, welcome back. My name is Felicia, and this is Grains and Grit, where we talk all about real whole grains from a biblical perspective. As stated, this is another video in our Grains Explorer Challenge that we are doing for 2024. And I can't believe we're already in March. This year's already going by so fast. How this works, real quick, Grains Explorer Challenge. Anyone can participate. Every month here on YouTube, I will be starting the month introducing the grain that we'll be working with for that month. We are challenging ourselves to explore new grains beyond our comfort zone. Now, for the full adventure, be sure to be a part of the Grainy Bunch, where they get exclusive videos and recipes to go even deeper with this challenge. So if you want to catch up, we got a playlist for you with everything for 2024 with the Grains Explorer Challenge. And to check out more and to sign up for the Grainy Bunch, just go to grainsandgrit.com/grainsexplorer. All right, now this month is rice, and there's a lot to cover, so buckle up, Buttercup, and you may want a pen and paper to take some notes. So as always, what we're going to be covering is a general overview and history of rice, the nutritional benefits, what rice is used for, types of rice you can find, how to use rice in your kitchen, and a bonus this time, tips for storing it. First up, a general overview and history of rice. So archaeologists are a little unsure of where rice originated, but many historians believe that rice was first grown as far back as 5,000 years ago, which pretty much matches up with the Bible because that would be shortly after Noah's flood. The first recorded mention of rice is from China. Shocker, I know. The Chinese Emperor Shen Nung, forgive me for slaughtering that pronunciation, realized the importance of rice, and he began to honor the grain by establishing annual rice ceremonies to be held at sowing time, and the emperor would plant the first seeds. Rice is actually still celebrated in China today in the 3-day Honey Rice Festival that's held in October. Yunnan, China is the homeland of rice to the Chinese nation and is known as the source of rice culture throughout the whole world. So although scientists cannot identify whether China, India, or Thailand were the original home of rice, I personally think it was native to all of it. We can confirm that it originates from Asia. Now, fun fact, it is easier to determine when it was introduced to Europe and the Americas thanks to all the many travelers and explorers, all the things. So some believe that it actually traveled to America in 1694 on a British ship that was bound for Madagascar, and they were blown off course. They needed repairs, and so they ended up in Charleston, South Carolina. The colonists helped repair, and in exchange, Captain James Thurber presented them with a quantity of rice seed. Unfortunately, the British completely messed this up thanks to the American Revolution. The British, when they were occupying Charleston, South Carolina, they then took all of the rice, every grain, left nothing for seed. So there was no more seed for the next year's crop. Thankfully, President Thomas Jefferson decided to illegally smuggle some out of Italy in the late 18th century. And then it transplanted from the Carolinas to the southern states surrounding the Mississippi Basin. So thank you, President Jefferson, for breaking Italian law. Now, obviously, we have cultural significance to rice. It is often associated with prosperity, and a lot of folklore and legends surround the grain. So in Japan, rice has its own patron god, Inari, I think is how you say it. And in Indonesia, its own goddess, the Dewi Sri. Again, bad pronunciation. Now, rice is also linked to fertility, and that is why we have a tradition of throwing rice at a newly wedded couple. And in India, rice is generally the first food that a bride presents to her husband to ensure fertility in the marriage. And children are given rice as their first solid food. And then this one's my favorite because according to good old Cajun folklore, the test of a true Cajun is whether they can calculate the precise quantity of gravy needed to accompany a crop of rice grown out in the fields. God bless the Cajuns. Okay, so some tips about where rice can be grown in case you feel like planting your own rice. It's actually not diverse of a grain. Many grains can be planted in rolling hills, and the diversity of the land. Rice actually needs very flat land. It requires immense quantities of water in its early days, followed by a long and uninterrupted season of hot and dry weather. And farmers need to be able to drain and re-wet their fields regularly. And that's why rice fields are flat. So rice in the world today. It is the fourth most produced crop, and it follows after sugarcane, maize, and wheat. Only 8% of rice is actually traded internationally. China, India, and Indonesia are the largest consumers of rice. China and India combined produce 52% of the world's rice. And China is the number one producer, followed by India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Vietnam, and then Thailand. And just those five consist of 90% of the world's production of rice. Now, in the United States, about 20 billion pounds of rice are produced annually. And the main states for this are Arkansas, California, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, and Texas. And half of their crop actually stays right here in the United States. And it actually accounts for 80% of the rice that we consume here in the United States. The other half is exported to over 120 countries. The complete genome of rice was actually sequenced in 2005, which can lead to genetic modification. But it actually was the very first crop to have their entire genome sequenced out. Okay, that was a lot. Second up, nutritional benefits of rice. Now, like wheat, it depends on the type that you were eating, which we will get into later. But rice overall contains 15 essential vitamins and minerals, including folic acid, B vitamins, potassium, magnesium, selenium, fiber, iron, and zinc. It is gluten-free and actually the least allergenic of all the grains. And if in its whole grain form, like brown rice, just like many grains, have been shown to reduce the risk of heart disease, diabetes, and certain cancers. Also lowers the risk of high blood pressure. It is nutrient dense and a complex carb, which means that the body slowly digests it. Next up, what rice is used for? Obviously, eating. Rice is used for eating. It is especially needed in a lot of Asian and Middle Eastern cuisine. Then you also have things like rice noodles, rice flour. It's used in breakfast cereal and in alcoholic beverages like the Japanese sake. Sake. You know what I mean. Now, other useful uses of rice. Many of y'all know it dries out your electronics. You can use them as heat compresses. It unclogs your salt shakers. It sharpens the blades in your blender. It cleans your coffee grinders and, as you know, our grain mills. Now, the big topic. Types of rice. And holy moly, there are a lot. I will be flashing them up here on the screen. We're going to get through them fast. First up, arborio rice. And I think I pronounced that right. Arborio rice. It's a medium grain, whiter in size, characteristic white dot at the center. It is named after the town of Arborio in the Po Valley of Italy, where it's grown. Due to its high starch content, it's slightly chewy and sticky consistency. It develops a cream texture when cooked and is used for risotto, rice pudding, and soup. Second up, basmati rice. When cooked, grains are long, dry, and separate. It has a nutty aroma and flavor. It is common in India and Asian cuisine, but can be used in many recipes. Used for dal, curry, pilafs, and saffron rice. Number 3, black rice. Yep, that's a thing. It is also known as the forbidden rice. It is a long, medium, or short grain. Same antioxidant that's found in blueberries and blackberries. It has a mild, nutty, earthy flavor. It's used in Chinese cuisine for its health-promoting properties, and it's used for bowls, rice pudding, soups, rice salads, and Chinese black rice cake. Number 4, bomba rice, which I've actually never heard of. It's a short grain. It's cultivated in the Valencia region of Spain. It has a firm texture, perfect for Spanish paella. Paella? You know what I mean. Needs more liquid to absorb when cooking than other varieties. mild flavor, absorbs the flavor and aroma of the stock and spices cooked with, and it's used for paella, Mediterranean dishes, and risotto. Number 5, one that we all know of, brown rice. And this is specifically what we will be focusing on for the Grains Explorer Challenge. It is the whole grain of rice that has the bran and the germ layers intact. It has a firmer texture, nuttier flavor, provides more fiber, vitamins, and minerals per serving. It comes in long, medium, or short grains, and it's used for everything. Stuffing, bowls, casseroles, stir fries, rice pilaf, etc. Number 6, jasmine rice. It is from Thailand, brings exotic flair, pleasant floral aroma, and it's very nutty. Moist, soft texture when cooked. It's a long grain, and it's used in curry, stir-fry dishes, and all Thai dishes. I can tell you that from experience, and other Asian dishes as well. Number 7, also one of the most common ones, is long grain white rice. It's the most common rice used in American recipes. Also popular in Asian Mexican cuisine. Compared to brown rice, has a mild flavor. Lighter, fluffier texture when cooked, also takes less time than brown rice, as we all know. Now, it does have a lower nutritional content due to its milling process because it's had that German bran removed. And again, it's used for everything just like brown rice. Then we have parboiled rice. Rice that has been partially boiled in its edible outer husk. It improves texture of the rice and cuts down on cooking time. And it saves some of the original vitamins and minerals. And it's technically a cooking method rather than a variety, but you can buy it in long, medium, or short grain. It has a mild, nutty flavor. And again, it's used for everything that brown and white rice are used for. Number 9, sticky rice. Also known as glutinous rice or sweet rice. Long grain white rice has a low starch content, causes it to have an extremely sticky texture when steamed, grown mainly in Southeast and East Asia, has a mild flavor, and it's used for dumplings, desserts, rice balls, and stuffing. Number 10, sushi rice. Technically a short grain white or brown rice that has a soft, tender, and very sticky texture. And it's made by combining short grain white or brown rice with sugar, salt, and vinegar. Oftentimes, short grain white or brown rice will be labeled as sushi rice to show its ideal uses for sushi. It has a mild flavor, and it's used for, you guessed it, sushi, rice balls, poke balls, and sushi burritos. All right, number 11, wild rice. Shocker, it's technically not a rice. It actually comes from seeds harvested from 4 types of semi-aquatic grasses that are native to North America. It's a long grain, more pronounced earthy and nutty flavor and firm texture. It can be used similar to white or brown rice, but with longer cooking time. And it's used in soups, casseroles, and rice pilafs. Number 12, yellow rice. Also a way of cooking on an actual rice that's grown. Yellow rice is not actually grown. The long grain white rice that is flavored and turned yellow with the addition of saffron and turmeric. It is popular in many different cuisines, including South and Central American, South African, Indian, and Asian cuisines. And number 13, polished rice. Another name for white or milled rice that has been milled to remove the husk, bran, and germ. It is the least nutritional value, obviously. Okay, so those are all the different varieties that I could come up with. Now let's actually talk about the difference between long, medium, and short grain. First of all, what we mean by that, it's referring to the shape of the grain. Long grain rice has a longer cylindrical shape. Short grain rice will have shorter and wider shape. So let's talk about long grain rice. It is at least 3 to 4 times as long as it is wide. It's a light and fluffy texture that separates when cooked, key thing there, and it's commonly used to make bowls, pilafs, casseroles, and stir fries. Then you have medium grain. It is shorter and wider than long grain, chewy, tender, and slightly sticky texture when cooked, commonly used to make risotto, paella, and side dishes. And then last but not least, the short grain, less than twice as long as it is wide, soft, tender, and sticky texture when cooked. This is what's commonly used to make sushi, poke balls, or bowls, and rice balls. There, we did it. Okay, now let's talk about how to use it in your kitchen. So again, with the Grains Explorer Challenge, we'll be focusing on brown rice or really any whole grain rice if I have just forgotten to mention it. But bottom line, we do whole grains here, y'all. No white rice here. No white rice. Not doing it. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about why rinse rice. If you read many recipes, they tell you to rinse your rice.
And there are a couple reasons for this. One, it actually helps remove any pesticides that were left over. So this is definitely important if you're not buying organic rice. But two, it actually gets rid of excess starch, which can help it, be softer or stickier or things like that. Now, some people will say, like on the package, to not wash the rice. That is because they will say it's been enriched with water-soluble vitamins and minerals. But again, enriched, if you're using a whole grain, it's not being enriched. So this should not be a reason to not wash your rice because you should be using a whole grain. There you go. Now, how to cook brown rice. I know for years I couldn't get it right. It will save my life. I got white rice down, but couldn't get the brown rice down, and I didn't have a rice cooker or an Instant Pot like I do now. I had to figure out how to learn it do it on the stove. The technique that I found that works best is actually like the pasta method, where you dump your rice in a pot and you fill it up with water like you're doing pasta. Then you add some salt to it, you bring it up to a boil, and then you let it, when it comes to a boil, then you let it simmer for about 45 to 50 minutes until the rice is done. And then you drain the rice, not completely, but mostly drained. And then you put a lid on it. Keep it off of the burner. You're not cooking anymore, but you want the lid on it to steam it for a good 15 to 20 minutes. And that worked, my friend. Then, of course, if you're like me, you have an Instant Pot, easy peasy way to make rice. So with brown rice, 1 cup of rice, 1¼ cups of water or stock, either one is fine, 20 minutes on high. It's pretty simple. Now, I usually double mine. This is an 8-quart Instant Pot, and I usually double that batch. And so when I double it, I found for me, for the 2 cups of brown rice, that 35 minutes seems to be the sweet spot for me. And then I let it release naturally, or at least let it steam naturally for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then you can release it. And for me, that comes out nice, fluffy brown rice every single time. Now, what to use rice for? And basically anything. You got rice and beans. If you're making gumbo, you need some rice. So many Mexican foods and Hispanic foods need rice with that. You can throw it into soups. Any Asian cuisine, you got your fried rice, side dishes if seasoned well. I mean, really, what can you not use rice for? I mean, really. Okay, now the bonus time, how to store rice. I know I've talked about how to store grains for forever. So I've done a little bit of research about this because there's a bit of controversy when it comes to rice and things that you need to know about. And I'm also going to share you what I've dealt with personally. Now, you have seen that usually whenever I'm storing rice, I like to buy it in bulk. And even with my brown rice, I usually do like to freeze it. And then after freezing it for about 24 to 48 hours, I just take it and I dump it into a bucket with a good lid to keep all bugs and moisture out. And I honestly, they're in my shed and I haven't had a problem. And I've even had some long term. I personally have not had a problem, but according to the interwebs, here's what they say about storing it. Now, if you do not want to freeze or you cannot freeze rice, throw in oxygen absorbers and just make sure you have enough for the size container that you have to make sure no bugs or anything like that hatch. So that's definitely a good thing. But if you are wanting to store long term, they actually state that white rice is better for the long term because brown rice has the bran layer on the outside, which also contains a lot of oils. And so they state that after 6 months of storage, that brown rice can go rancid. Again, I personally have not had that happen. But be that as it may. So here's what I would do. I really don't want to store, like if you're a prepper and you want to store rice, I really don't want to store white rice. So I do recommend, first of all, rotating your grains always. So just use it and rotate it. Buy what you want and then just make sure that you rotate it so it doesn't go bad. But if you want it to kind of just sit there, I would probably do the freeze method, freeze it. I would put it in Mylar bags with oxygen absorbers and then in a good container, like a bucket with a good lid, all to be safe. And I think for that would probably last longer. I do not know how much longer. If you go to Wallaby Goods for their Mylar bags and oxygen absorbers, I do have a coupon code for y'all. I'll list that here and the link down in the description box. I think they tell you about brown rice. So that's something to consider with rice. Again, I haven't had a problem. I haven't kept it for 30 years. but just personal thing for me. And I'm here in Florida where it's very hot, it's very humid, and it's in my shed, which is not air conditioned in the slightest. And it's been fine. Now, do know one thing about rice is rice does absorb the smells and the flavors of wherever it is. So make sure if you're storing it in a bucket, that it's a food grade safe bucket. So it's not absorbing any sort of chemicals or any weird smells or anything like that. Okay, we did it. We did it. I covered it. Oh my word, that was a lot of information. So again, I hope y'all are enjoying this Grains Explorer Challenge. Be sure to check up here. This is the playlist to be catching up with whatever we've been doing in 2024, depending on whenever you see this video. And again, if you want to join the full adventure, be sure to join us over on the Grainy Bunch. They're my diehard Grainies. You know I love you. grainsandgrit.com/grains explorer for all the details. And enjoy rice. Let me know what you're making with rice this month. And as always, I hope y'all have a wonderful day. See you next week. Bye.
Welcome to April, and it's time for us to introduce a new grain for our Grains Explorer Challenge for 2024. And this month, we're going to be looking at the world's tiniest grain, Teff. Hey y'all, welcome back to Grains and Grit. My name is Felicia, and on this channel, we talk all things real whole grains from a biblical perspective. So as I mentioned, this is another video for our Grains Explorer Challenge for 2024, where we are exploring all kinds of different grains for 2024. We pick one each month, and we experiment with it and we figure it out. And these are grains that are not very well known to us. So be sure to follow along. And if this is your first video that you have seen with the Grains Explorer Challenge and you want to catch up, be sure to check out the playlist up here so you can catch up with the other grains that we've explored so far. Now, of course, for the full adventure, that is actually reserved for the Grainy Bunch. So if you're one of my Grainies, you will actually be you get extra recipes, videos, and more. So to know more about the Grains Explorer Challenge and also to sign up for the Grainy Bunch for the full adventure, be sure to go to grainsandgrit.com/grains explorer. Okay, so let's talk about this month's grain, which is Teff, possibly one that you've never heard of. And I will go ahead and apologize in advance. I feel a little bit under the weather today, so got some things going on. Now, as always, here's what we will be covering in this video. We will first be giving y'all a general overview and history of the grain, nutritional benefits, what Teff is used for, and we wrap it up with how you can use Teff in your own kitchen at home. Before we begin, be sure to comment below if you've actually used Teff, if you've ever heard of it. What do you plan on making with it? Let me know your thoughts, especially, did you even know about Teff? And then what did you learn in this video? Just tell me all the things that's on your brain in the comments below. So first off, general overview and history of Teff. So what in the world is Teff? It is actually a grain that is predominantly grown in Ethiopia. It is an ancient grain that they have been growing. Archaeologists and historians date it back to about 4,000 years BC, which, comes right after the flood. Totally fits. It comes in a variety of colors from red to brown. I actually have the brown variety sitting back there. And it's actually the world's smallest grain. I mean, these things are tiny. I mean, you can't even tell that these are grains. Each one, see right here, the light is in it, but super, super, super tiny grains. They say that 140 grains of Teff can actually fit in your fingernail, which is so crazy. Imagine 140 wheat berries. That's probably about a cup or more. And as I stated, it is an ancient grain and it is naturally gluten-free, which is why it's becoming a bit more popular in the West thanks to all the gluten-free diets. Now, as I stated, it is predominantly grown in African countries, especially Ethiopia. I mean, this is just a pure Ethiopian grain. It is a staple. This is their staple grain for that country. However, thanks to advanced farming methods, they are finding that Teff can be grown elsewhere. And in fact, here in the United States, Idaho is actually producing some great quality Teff. It is a hardy plant. If you feel like growing it, it can be grown in all sorts of conditions. However, it wasn't until recently that farmers just haven't really been able to grow it, except in Ethiopia. As far as where the word Teff came from, it is believed that it comes from the Amharic word Teffa, which actually means lost, which I think is very appropriate because this grain seed is so tiny. I can only imagine how many have gotten lost. Another fun fact is it was actually very sacred in ancient Egypt. And in fact, it was so sacred that it was usually one of the last foods placed in an Egyptian pharaoh's tomb as their last meal. So pretty cool history there. Again, an ancient of ancient grains that ultimately wasn't really even known to those of us in the West until fairly recently. Now, next up, the nutritional benefits of teff. So like many whole grains, it is actually a great source of copper, manganese, magnesium, selenium, phosphorus, and zinc. But again, that's in many whole grains. Now, where it does shine, it is actually higher in fiber usually than typical wheat and barley. So it's a very high fiber grain and is actually very high in lysine, which if you've watched me or watched these videos before, wheat as the king of all grains is actually a bit deficient in lysine. So I usually say just eat some beans with it, or you can actually consume teff to be able to get that great lysine content. And that actually leads to the other benefit where teff is actually a very high protein grain. In fact, Ethiopia is actually famous for their long distance runners, and they credit that to teff because Ethiopians get about 2/3 of their protein from this teeny little grain. It's actually a power punch in calcium. In fact, it actually is the highest amount of calcium as far as the grains go. The best amount of calcium is going to be found in teff. And it's also high in vitamin C, another one that is actually a bit deficient with wheat. And of course, already stated, it is a gluten-free grain as well. All right, so what in the world is this tiny little grain used for? And the most famous dish that teff is used for is the Ethiopian fermented bread called injera. It's actually a flat bread, super easy to make as far as like a sourdough type bread that as far as that goes. So basically, I mean, all that you're doing is just grinding up some teff, adding in some water, let it sit there for 4 or 5 days to ferment, and then it is a flatbread, so you don't have to worry about like all the rising and all the things like that. So again, this is the main staple for their bread in Ethiopia, and how they use injera bread is a lot like a plate. Many times they'll make these huge flatbreads of injera, and they'll just serve their food on it, and you're eating the bread as you're consuming the meal. I actually plan on myself making not only injera bread, and I do hope to share that with y'all sometime this month. For my grainies in the grainy bunch, I'll be showing y'all the full version where I'm actually wanting to make Dora Wat, which is a very famous Ethiopian dish with the injera bread. And I'm super excited to try to make it because I've actually never had Ethiopian food before. And now I get to do it here at home. So be sure to stay tuned, my grainies. Now, because of the popularity of gluten-free grains and all of that in the West, teff has also been used for cupcakes and cakes and porridge, and I mean, just many things that you would use a gluten-free flour or combination of gluten-free grains. Teff is actually thrown in there with some of them as well. Just know that obviously with it being a brown grain, the brown one at least, that you're going to get some color to it that you're not going to get from other grains. Just remember that it is gluten-free, so it's going to lack that typical chewy type texture that you find with grains that contain gluten. So actually let me know if you've actually tried injera bread. I love to hear about it. Do know that typically in the United States, if you've been to a restaurant to kind of appease Western palates, many times if it looks fluffier, they're adding in wheat flour or barley flour. So do know that if you're going out and getting injera bread, ask if it's actually 100% teff flour used or if they're adding in those other grains. And last but not least, how to use teff in your kitchen. So fun fact about teff is you actually never find a white flour type version of teff. And that's because the grains are so tiny, they do not separate they do not separate the bran and the germ out of teff. So even if you buy the flour, teff flour, that is a whole grain flour. Now, of course, you know, on this channel, I do recommend milling it yourself at home because that way you get the full maximum benefits. Because when you mill grains, oxidation starts to occur and certain vitamins are going to start leaving the scene in just a few days. So if you're able to grind it at home, definitely grind it at home. But do know if you maybe don't have a grain mill right now, you can actually buy the teff flour, knowing that it is whole grain. So as I already mentioned, how to use it at home, the most popular dish is injera bread. It looks super easy to make. As of recording this, I have not made it yet. So for me, I'm like, oh, it looks so easy. I'm hoping I haven't stuck my foot in my mouth, that it is still pretty easy. But that is the most common thing to use teff flour. But you can actually make teff porridge. You can use it in so many things. I've actually seen it in like gluten-free breads being used there. Usually they're adding in, of course, other things to make it more of a bread type product. They also use it in other dishes for Ethiopian cooking, like Ethiopian stews. So there's actually many different things to use. And that's what this Grains Explorer Challenge is all about, is to get out of our comfort zone and try new things that we may not have tried on our own. So there you go. Short intro about teff. Pretty simple grain. Again, this one is I'm most excited about. I've literally had this on my shelves for a long time now, but I've just yet to use it. Do know teff is a bit harder to find. I did buy mine from Azure Standard, the whole grain, so I can mill it myself. I'm not sure where else to find it, so I'll link it to Azure Standard down below. But if I can find it anywhere else, like on Amazon, I think Country Living Foods actually has it, so I'll link them down below, and any coupon codes that I have as well. So let me know what you plan on trying to use with teff. Do you plan on actually using it this month? Are you wanting to avoid it like the plague? Let me know your thoughts down below. And as always, to catch up on the challenge, to sign up for the Grainy Bunch, view more details, see what other grains we're going to be exploring this year. All of those details can be found at grainsandgrit.com/grainsexplorer. And as always, I hope y'all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next week. Bye. Welcome to May. It is now time to finally introduce another grain in our Grains Explorer Challenge for 2024. And this month is a very surprising grain. It's actually technically not seen as a grain, but it is considered a super grain, and it is actually disrupting a bit of what we may know about history. So stay tuned, because in this video, we're going to be talking all about amaranth. Hey y'all, welcome back to Grains and Grit. My name is Felicia, and on this channel we talk all things real whole grains, all from a biblical perspective. So for those of you who are new, we are doing the Grains Explorer Challenge for the year of 2024, which means that each and every month I'm going to be introducing a new grain that is possibly new to you to help us expand our horizons and kind of, in a way, encourage us to try out grains that you may have not tried before, or maybe you haven't even heard about. Every month I post a Meet the Grain video to introduce that grain for that month, and you can certainly follow along. You can follow us on Instagram, here on YouTube, however which way you like it. However, for the full adventure, be sure to check out the Grainy Bunch and join us Grainies over there in the Grainy Bunch, because they actually receive the full adventure, which means extra recipes, a bonus video, extra content, live hangouts, a private MeWe group, and more. So to check all that out, just go to grainsandgrit.com/grainsexplorer. That's also where you can sign up for the Grainy Bunch if you choose to do so. And in the meantime, if this is kind of your first video, be sure to check up here with the playlist, wherever it may be, to catch up with all the grains that we have been doing this year. Now, as always, what we'll be covering this video is first a general overview and history of amaranth, the nutritional benefits, what amaranth is generally used for today, and then we're going to wrap it all up with how you can actually use this fascinating little grain in your kitchen at home. Now, first, be sure to comment below about your experience with the amaranth. Have you heard of it? Are you familiar with it? Have you used it? What are your favorite recipes? All the things, let us know in the comments below. So first up, let's talk about a general overview and history of amaranth. And I have to say, when researching this, it truly is fascinating. I say that every month.
but it is, because I learn things every single month, and it's truly amazing to see God's design, especially when it comes to his grains. Now, first and foremost, amaranth is technically, by our modern scientific classification standard, is not considered a grain, or specifically one of the cereal grains like wheat, barley, and oats. It's actually considered a pseudo cereal, but it's seen as a whole grain, but technically not one of the typical whole grains that we know. Bottom line, the way that I see it is God gave us every seed for us to eat. Grains are seed, no matter how they're harvested. So that's how I see it. That's why I just classify this as just a grain as God intended it to be. Now, it is very unique because it's definitely not on your typical grain looking type plants like wheat, barley, and oats. It actually is a flowering plant that can grow 7 to 8 to 9 feet tall, has a very thick stalk like the sunflower seeds, or sunflowers, if you've ever seen sunflowers growing up in the fields. Amaranth is similar to that. Very unique ornamental flower as well. And amaranth is actually harvested from inside the flowers. The flowers actually contain the seeds, and that's where we receive amaranth. It is also another teeny tiny little grain like teff, like we explored last month. Now, it is easily adaptable to different growing conditions and is very drought resistant. And amaranth today is definitely found all over the world, and scientists estimate around 70 different varieties, but only about a dozen or so have been cultivated by humans all around the world to cultivate for our use. Now, let's talk about the origins, the history of amaranth. So the word amaranth actually comes from the Greek word amarantos. I don't speak Greek. Let me know if I pronounced that correctly, which actually means one that does not wither or never fading. And that is because the beautiful flowers actually do not fade. Their color does not go away. They still look beautiful even after being cut and dried, unlike other flowers. If you've had flowers before, they eventually wilt and the color actually fades. And that's not the case with amaranth flowers, which is why amaranth actually is used a lot in ancient cultures as a symbol for immortality. And because of that, leads that yes, it is an ancient grain. Archaeologists have dated this back, several thousand years BC. We actually see it in ancient Asian cultures. And again, it was used as a symbol of immortality. It was also known as king seed or sent by God because of its flavor and its nourishment that provided. And we'll get into the amazing health benefits of this later. The Aztecs believed that it could turn a weak man into a powerful warrior. And they actually sometimes called it the food of immortality. It is mentioned in Aesop's Fables, which was written in 6th century BC. It is also mentioned in Milton's Paradise Lost, which was written in the 1600s. And I will have to post this maybe here of the poem, especially in Aesop Fables, because I thought it was extremely beautiful. So feel free to pause this video to read it here because I really, really liked it. In ancient Central America, it was actually a crucial crop for the Aztecs, which may surprise you because many of us do not associate amaranth with Mexican food like we do with the corn and the beans, which we know was an ancient food of the Aztecs. But it was a very important crop to the Aztecs. It was mainly used in religious ceremonies. They would consume it, but it was mainly used for religious purposes, religious ceremonies, and not necessarily for daily regular consumption like they did with the maize and the beans and all the other things that they ate. Now, while it was a very important crop for the Aztecs, it was also a very important crop in Asia, which leads to the historical controversy here. Or not really controversy, but a bit of a historical dilemma that archaeologists and scientists have kind of come across thanks to this little teeny tiny little grain. Now, I don't know about you, but I was basically raised believing that there was not really transoceanic trade and things like that going on before Columbus. We all hear the story of Columbus, being in Europe, and then he came over here, discovered the new world, surprise! We have a new continent, all of that stuff. And therein, the Europeans met with the Central Americans, the North Americans, South Americans. That's what I was taught a lot. And I wasn't really taught anything about the other side. Like, was there
Pacific Ocean trading and things like that. Most of the time, I mean, I just know I was generally under the impression that the continents did not trade with each other really until after Columbus. But one thing that scientists and archaeologists have found is that they do believe that the origins of amaranth were based in Mexico, Central America, that type of area. But they've actually compared that to the amaranth that is found in Asia. The fact that it dates back so long ago, again, BC. I mean, this is well before Columbus sailed in 1492. And they are finding amaranth in Asia. They once believed that maybe these were different species, but they've actually compared them and they are very, 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 very similarly related. They are very close to each other. And there's not as much variety of amaranth in Asia as there is in Mexico, Central America, and South America, which has led them to actually be open to the fact that there actually was possibly transoceanic trading from Asia to Central and South America way long ago. And that's how Asians got amaranth because of the reason that there is no huge variety. There's more variety in Central and South America. That's why they believe that that is where amaranth originated from. But this is kind of causing a stir in history because this possibly is proof that, people were actually going across the Pacific Ocean from Asia all the way over here to Central and South America way before our modern archaeologists and historians believe. And I find that very fascinating. And I do believe my husband and I both were talking about this, and he absolutely believes this is totally possible and was true, even back when King Solomon was king, because think of the wealth that Solomon had. I mean, the world was basically at his feet. And God also said that there would be no kingdom or king as wealthy or as wise as him. And you have to think of all the resources available to him. We also know that the Vikings traipsed from Europe over to North America to do raids long before Columbus time. So there was stuff going on, and I find it very fascinating that something as a grain, a teeny little seed, can actually be a crucial link to history to show us more of the history that we have possibly lost. So that might be very boring to you if you absolutely hate history, but I love history. And so this was completely fascinating to me. Now, again, I was surprised that amaranth was so popular in Central and South America because it's typically not seen as that popular today. And that's mainly because when the Spanish conquistadors came over to South America and Central America, they actually banned amaranth, but it did survive. But it did not become very popular when they took it over to Europe. And so, between banning it in South America and then didn't really take off in Europe, it kind of died out, but it actually did become very popular in Africa. And it's also common in Caribbean food as well. So it's still there, but the popularity kind of died off a little bit. But it is coming back, which leads us to the actual number 2, the health benefits, the nutritional value of amaranth. And this is where it truly shines as a super grain. Like many of the other pseudo cereals, like quinoa, they're considered very, very high a protein power punch. They are super grains when it comes to protein. So if you're new here, just remember that wheat is king of the grains, but it actually is slightly deficient in 4 of the essential nutrients that we need. And lysine, some protein, is actually part of that. It is not a complete protein. You got to pair it with other things like beans to actually make it a complete protein. Amaranth and other pseudo cereals are actually complete proteins. They contain all of the 9 essential amino acids that are needed. So if you are vegetarian or vegan, you do not have meat, this is definitely a grain that you want because of the protein. You will not be lacking in your protein. It is a wonderful grain for that. And to give you a bit more perspective of the amount of protein, it's around 14% protein, which is double that of rice and corn. In fact, researchers in Guatemala actually found it to be one of the most nutritious plant-based proteins that we have, or at least know of today. So again, if you're not really a meat eater, this is definitely a grain that you need to have in your arsenal
to be able to give you this very essential protein that is needed. Now, as you probably guessed, being a pseudo cereal, it is a naturally gluten-free grain. So those who may need to stay away from gluten, or for whatever reason you're choosing not to have it, this is an excellent grain to have while still having the nutritional power punch. And a great thing about amaranth is researchers in Mexico back in 2008, and this was published in a journal, they were the first to report that amaranth actually has lunacin, however you pronounce it. This is how it's spelled. It is a peptide that is actually found in amaranth. Before then, people generally knew of it as being very high in soybeans, and it is widely thought to have cancer preventative qualities, anti-inflammatory qualities, especially those anti-inflammatory qualities that can help prevent diabetes, heart disease, and more. And I'm pretty sure all of us are totally on board with anything that could possibly prevent cancer. I know I am. Now, as a whole grain, this is why it is classified as a whole grain, is it does have a lot of the nutrients that typical whole grains do have. It has greater or less than 10% of the recommended daily value of protein, fiber, iron, selenium, and B vitamins, specifically the B6 strand of B vitamins, and is actually greater than or equal to 20% of the recommended daily intake of magnesium and phosphorus, and contains half of the daily recommended value of manganese, which actually is needed to help you break down protein and other macronutrients. So to give you a bit of a serving size idea here of what amaranth contains, about a quarter cup of uncooked amaranth, which is generally considered a serving, contains about 180 calories, 3 grams of fiber, and 7 grams of protein. So pretty cool, huh? Pretty cool little super grain that we have here. So to recap, remember, if you are definitely not a meat eater and you're needing a good source of protein, this is an excellent grain to use. All right, now what is amaranth used for today? This is number 3. Traditionally, is actually a pretty popular breakfast porridge in places like Mexico, Nepal, India, and Peru. The entire plant is actually used. The leaves are actually used more as a vegetable and can be seen in Caribbean, African, and Asian cuisine. Of course, the seeds can be eaten whole or milled into flour for consumption for you to eat. And then the flowers are generally used as decoration. Now, thanks to the rise of a whole gluten-free aspect in the Western cultures like the United States, it is becoming far more popular of a grain due to its gluten-free qualities. Now, fascinating is according to the NIH, which is the National Institute of Health here in the United States, it is actually widely used in the pharmaceutical industry to produce medicinal products to help combat diseases such as ulcers, such as stomach ulcer, tuberculosis, as well as antiseptic, antifungal, and anti-inflammatory preparations. Found that pretty fascinating. It's also many times people just grow it as an ornamental plant because it is very pretty. And as with many other grains, it can be used to make alcohol. It can be fermented to make a type of alcohol. The only place I saw this is I did see it on one blog post where they talked about an amaranth Belgian table ale that they did as a home brew. So I don't think this is something you can buy. It's generally seen in like the home brewing type industry. And they said it was actually pretty delicious. Now, last but not least, how to use amaranth in your kitchen. So you've got some, now how to use it. And there are so many ways to do this. First of all, it can just be milled up and eaten as a porridge. So if you get tired of oats or other things like that, you can just have it as a good porridge and use whatever you like with porridge. Bananas, apples, nuts, honey, whatever. The taste of it is generally described as being an earthy, grassy, light, nutty, a bit peppery. So keep that in mind. And it does pair well with squash, corn, cinnamon, vanilla, and chocolate. Now, a little note before we continue on about milling these teeny little grains like amaranth and also teff that I forgot to mention in last video. Sue Becker actually talks about this in her home ground flour cookbook, and she mentions that teeny little grains like this, you may not want to just dump in all at once to your mill because it may clog. So you may need to just turn on that mill and gradually add in the grains to keep it from being clogged because these are super tiny. The exception is if you actually have some sort of attachment that is used for small grains. Now, I also say with these tiny little grains, they would probably be very easy to use in a high-powered blender or even in a coffee grinder because, again, they're just that tiny. All right, so there you go about how to mill it. So again, I mentioned that you can use this as a porridge. Like all the grains, you can just boil it and then dress it up however you want. So do know with how to boil amaranth, actually cook it as a whole grain. So this is without a mill. You just need to take 1 cup of dried whole amaranth and place it into 2 cups of whatever liquid that you like, water, a stock, whatever it is. Bring that to a boil and then simmer for about 15 to 20 minutes until it is cooked. Just know that 1 cup of dried amaranth will come out to about 2.5 cups of cooked amaranth. All right, it can also be used in any sort of polenta style recipe if you like that. And a cool thing like sorghum that I discovered is it can be popped like popcorn. And in fact, this actually is a popular snack in Mexico to this day where they pop amaranth and then they mix it with some honey and eat it like that. And that actually goes all the way back to the Aztecs. You can also pop it and use it in whatever type of granola recipe that you like as well. Another great thing, and Sue Becker talks about this again in her cookbook, is you can actually combine amaranth with sorghum for many different types of gluten-free recipes. And if you are looking for gluten-free recipes, whole grain, I actually do recommend Sue Becker's Homegrown Flour Cookbook. And while it's not strictly a gluten-free cookbook, in the notes for many, many recipes, she actually talks about tips for how to go gluten-free. And that's using things like sorghum and amaranth. So I definitely recommend checking that out. Of course, you can mill it and use it in just quick breads. You can use it in bread, in muffins, in pancakes, just whatever type of quick bread recipe you have. Mill up some amaranth and see how you like it. It's also frequently used to throw into soups because it does help thicken up some soups. And last but not least, I've seen recipes where people mill it up and bake cakes with them, use it in granola. I mean, there are just so many ways to use this recipe, and I'm actually looking forward to trying it out myself. So there you have it, y'all. You have met amaranth, a fascinating grain. I love the fact that it's disrupting history as we know it as well. And again, let me know in the comments below if you plan on trying this out, if you have tried amaranth out, and just give us some helpful tips. For all my grainies, be sure to be looking out for extra recipes in the member portal. And again, to find out more about the Grains Explorer Challenge, grainsandgrit.com/grainsexplorer. The link will be here in the description box below. As always, I hope y'all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next week. Bye.
Welcome to almost June, because technically this is coming out the last 2 days of May. But it's time to go ahead and introduce a new grain for our Grains Explorer Challenge that we're doing for 2024. And this month, it is not only another ancient grain, but kind of one that's a bit tricky to use, but also happens to be my favorite. This month, it's all about Kamut/Corazon wheat, but more about the differences between those two wheats later. Hey y'all, welcome back to Grains and Grit. My name is Felicia, and on this channel, you know, we talk about all the things real whole grains, all from a biblical perspective. So if you are a nerdy granny like me, then be sure to subscribe to this channel and like this video so more people will see it. So for those who are new, this is another video for our Grains Explorer Challenge for 2024. In the year 2024, we are challenging ourselves each month with a new grain and experimenting with it and seeing what all we can do with it, and also just learning about new grains, stretching our horizons beyond the typical grains that you might reach for. And as I mentioned in previous months, for the full adventure, be sure to join the Grainy Bunch, which is a wonderful group of grainies, and they get extra recipes, videos, and also a community to swap recipes and to talk about what went right, what went wrong, so on and so forth. Now again, you can join this challenge whether you're part of the Grainy Bunch or not. They just get a bit extra to go on the full adventure. So be sure to check out the details of the Grains Explorer Challenge. You can just go to grainsandgrit.com/grainsexplorer. And also from there, you can sign up for the Grainy Bunch if you choose to do so. And speaking of my grainies, I need to do a little shout out to just a few of my grainies. So huge shout out to Tina J and Julie M, Leanne F, Donna S, and Mary A. So you know who you are. Thank you so very much for being one of my grannies. You know I love you. So if this is your first video for the Grains Explorer Challenge, then be sure to check out the whole playlist up here to get caught up to see what grains we have done so far. All right, so this is actually going to be a two-part video. The first time I've actually done two parts of it because it just deserves two videos. The first part is going to be this one. Part one is going to be this meet the grain. We're going to be meeting Kamut/Corazon and talking all about it so you actually get to know it a bit better. And then part two will be out next week, and that's where I'm going to be showing y'all the best rolls you've ever had in your life, and that is because they are made with Kamut. But it's a tricky grain, so that's why I think it needs its dedicated video to go in a bit more depth of how to use this ancient grain. Now, as always, in this video, here's what we're going to be covering. Now, this one's going to be different because we're going to start with the difference between Kamut and Corazon, because you've probably seen them both, wondering what the difference is. And then, of course, we're just going to be going over a general overview and history of Kamut/Corazon, the nutritional benefits, what this grain is used for, and how to use Kamut in your kitchen, and my personal recommendations. So before we begin, be sure to comment below to let me know, what is your experience with Kamut? Do you like it? Do you plan on trying it? What are your favorite recipes with it? Have you tried it and it's been a disaster? I'd like to know. Let me know in the comments below. So first off, let's talk about the difference between Kamut and Corazon, because if you start shopping for this, you're gonna see those two names used interchangeably. And first off is the actual wheat. There is no difference with the actual wheat itself. This is the same wheat berry. However, Kamut is actually the trademark name for Corazon, and we'll get into the history of it later. But basically, the trademark was registered in order to preserve and protect this ancient grain. And so if you find Kamut, just know that that is trademarked and restricted to growing regulations. It's usually organic, so it has to meet certain qualifications in order to receive the trademark name, where Corazon does not have to meet those same expectations. So for example, Corazon may not necessarily be organic, but there is no GMO wheat, so you don't have to worry about that. But if organic is important to you, then may want to consider just buying the Kamut. But Corazon is usually a little bit cheaper because it's not the trademark name. So for the sake of this video, to not constantly be saying Kamut/Corazon, I'm just going to refer to it from here on out as Kamut. But just know I'm talking about the same wheat. Next up, let's talk about the history of Kamut. And the history of Kamut is actually a bit different than what I usually cover with the history of grains, because we actually don't know much about Kamut in regards to ancient times. We do know that it's an ancient wheat. They do say that it is probably from the Fertile Crescent, which, if you don't know where that is considered to be modern day Iraq, Iran, and Central Asia. It also has been studied and considered to be a cousin of wheat durum, actually a hybrid between wheat durum and a wild wheat called Triticum polonicum, or Triticum polonicum. Let me know how that's pronounced in the comments. So we do know that's an ancient grain, but don't really have much to go on after that until it arrives to the United States. Now, there is a website, kamut.com, that I do recommend going to, because this is where it really spells out the history of Kamut, and it's quite a fascinating story. So bottom line, the history of it began in 1949 when a U.S. airman stationed in Portugal, his name was Earl Deadman, he actually received some unusual looking wheat. And it was told to him that this was retrieved from tombs from the ancient pharaohs of Egypt. So this is part of it where you hear the story of where they've recovered wheat from ancient tombs and it's still been good and it grew. This is the origin of that story. But unfortunately, we do not have any way to confirm that. So it is figured that maybe it was just picked off, maybe it was just purchased from a street vendor in Cairo that stated they got it from one of the ancient tombs. We really don't know. No way to really verify that, but still a really cool story. So Earl actually sent just 36 kernels of wheat to his father, Rube, I think is how you pronounce it, Deadman, who was a farmer in Montana. So within a few years, they were able to take these 36 wheat berries to 15 bushels of wheat, which one bushel is usually what's used to seed about 1 acre of land. So they greatly increased the amount of these wheat berries. And he actually called it King Tut wheat at that time because of the story. So kind of died off, didn't really catch on in the 40s or 50s, but until a food show in Anaheim, California in 1986. And it immediately grew in popularity because now we're in the 1980s and people were now recognizing the fact that they could have this wheat whenever they were having problems with regular bread here in the US because of digestive issues, wheat sensitivities, things like that. And this was all before the whole gluten-free and gluten sensitivity, before we even knew about that. Back in the 80s, people were realizing, you know what, bread isn't really working with me, but they were finding that they could have this wheat. And so it very much intrigued them. Now, we will go into my theory of the easier digestibility later on when we talk about the nutritional benefits. But bottom line, it started to take off and the owner actually realized, hey, this is a great thing, but I want to preserve it and not allow it to be adulterated or anything like that. And that's why in 1990, they decided to trademark this grain and called it Kamut. And where they got that from is that's actually the ancient Egyptian word for wheat. So pretty clever there. So when you buy Kamut trademarked grain, this is a guarantee that it is an unhybridized, unmodified, ancient grain that we know and love. So that is a really cool story behind Kamut. Also, I know I've said in the past that I usually refer to this grain as Kamut, and that's because years ago, I could have sworn that's how I saw people referring to it, but according to Google and all the people and you know, everything, it is pronounced Kamut. So not Kamut, not Camus, Kamut. Okay, so let's now get into the nutritional benefits of Kamut. All right, so as I mentioned, what first caught the interest and why this has become a more popular grain nowadays is because people state that it is easier to digest than our modern wheats. But if you've watched this channel long enough, you probably know what I'm about to say. It's probably the flour, not the wheat. If we are comparing Kamut to our typical bleached white flour that has been stripped of the bran and germ and the nutrients and it's dead flour, then yes, possibly it is easier to digest. But let's compare apples to apples. Personally, I do believe that if you are milling your wheat at home, whether it is modern wheat or ancient grains, if you are consuming the entire wheat berry the way that God intended you to have, most likely you're not going to have a problem. But for those of you who still even might have problems with freshly milled hard red, hard white, or soft white wheat, then these ancient grains may possibly be an option for you. But as always, you should be milling at home or making sure that you at least have the whole grain, the entire wheat berry, bran, germ, all the things. I also will state that the flavor to Kamut is just, it's a wonderful, wonderful flavor. If you haven't tried it yet, it is a light, nutty, buttery. Whenever I make it, you would almost think that it was actually white flour that I was using. As you will see in the rolls recipe, that it actually is so much lighter of a flour. I mean, you would think I was probably using store-bought flour. And most likely, if you make things from Kamut, if you make baked goods from Kamut, people probably won't even know that it's a whole wheat, whole grain flour. It's that good. Now, some unique things about the nutritional value of Kamut is that it's actually about 40% higher in protein than our more modern wheats of today. It's also very rich in zinc, magnesium, and selenium, as well as many polyphenols and fatty acids. It is known as a more high energy grain because of its high percentage of lipids, which typically provide more energy than refined carbohydrates. But again, I think if you're milling your own wheat, you're gonna have that anyway. Now, from a personal note, just because it's a higher protein, that usually means, oh, higher protein, meaning it'll be better for yeast spreads. Not necessarily the case with Kamut, because as far as the things that you need to have a good gluten structure, it's actually a bit lower in. So I find that if you're wanting those tall yeast loaf of breads, that a hard red or hard white is probably going to be better for you and easier for you, especially as a newbie, than to actually use with this ancient grain. Loaves can be made, but a little bit more tricky. So back to the protein of Kamut, especially in to give y'all a better idea of the higher protein. A 1 cup serving of Kamut provides 9.8 grams of protein. So as a basis for comparison, brown rice usually contains about 4.5 grams of protein, and quinoa, which is generally seen as a higher protein grain, provides about 8 cups per 1 cup cooked of quinoa. So again, this is just a higher protein grain. So if you're wanting to go higher in your protein, but also wanting to incorporate whole grains, this is another great grain to use. And as usual with whole grains. It is high in fiber. It's going to, especially when you mill it at home, making sure you have that bran and the germ, you're getting all the nutrients and all of that wonderful fiber that God put in there to help you digest this grain. So what is kamut used for? Unfortunately, we don't really have the knowledge of how they typically used it with any certain cultures or ancient cultures. Again, it's kind of like the history kind of got cut off and then restarted in the 1940s and 50s. But it is considered a very popular health food nowadays, especially among those who are very sensitive to gluten. You're starting to see kamut being used in more like processed cereals, crackers, things like that. And it's just where wheat is used. I mean, it's great for bread, pasta, salads, boil it, use it in stews, those type of things. So that leads to how I actually recommend using kamut in your own kitchen at home. So again, I'm all about milling your own grains, consuming it whole yourself, not just buying the flour. So keep that in mind. Also a word, kamut being an ancient grain, it actually is it is quite expensive. You may have a bit of a sticker shock whenever you go out to buy kamut. So here's my recommendations. The lowest price I've seen with kamut is with Azure Standard, and they do actually carry kamut, the trademark grain, and they also carry Corzon, which will be a bit less expensive. Now I know that you've probably seen this if you're a part of Facebook groups and things like that, where people have said that the cleanliness of the grains that they receive from Azure Standard is kind of a hit and miss. And I do have to agree with, but I've ordered kamut from them many times, and I don't know if it's because it is trademarked, so more regulations with that, but it has always been a very clean grain, and I haven't had any problems with that, but I have not bought their Corzon. I have also bought kamut from Pleasant Hill Grain. It is more expensive there, but they definitely never have a problem with them. But it is a bit harder to find, but if you're wanting to try it, but a bit more on a budget, I do recommend Azure Standard, and I'll be linking all that for y'all below. Now, personally, as far as what to use kamut for in your own kitchen, it makes the best rolls. Again, part 2 video coming next week, and flour tortillas. I finally really nailed flour tortillas. I was already getting them soft, and that recipe I will link up here and down below. Flour tortillas with just a soft white wheat flour. But when you make it with kamut, now it is a different recipe. And so the grainy bunch, that's actually going to be a recipe for you guys this month. But you make it with kamut, and it is just so good. I do think kamut does the best when it comes to flatbreads, but it also is really good with rolls. It also makes delicious and amazing pizza crust. I also find that it mills into a very fine flour, kind of no matter what grain mill you have, just like how soft wheat tends to just mill and look a bit whiter. Kamut also mills very fine, but just know it's going to be slightly more of like a yellowish type color. Not like bright yellow, but you'll kind of notice it especially if you put it side by side with soft white wheat flour. You can also use it for other things like pancakes, waffles, muffins. You can make loaves of bread, but I find that, it's a tricky grain. I do not recommend using this grain for newbies. If you're new to freshly milled wheat, get used to making it with hard red or hard white wheat first to understand what you're going for. And then you can make those judgment calls when switching over to kamut. Because as you see next week, you can see where this can really go wrong really badly. So again, be sure to check out next week's video. If it's up, I'll link it down below and up here for y'all to know how to make these rolls. And it's also going to give you a better idea of how kamut works as a grain. I tend to find that it's a bit more tacky and sticky to work with, but it is worth it. All right, so there you go. My grainies in the grainy bunch. Be sure to look out for extra recipes this month. Check out your member portal. And if you want to know more about this Grains Explorer Challenge, just go to grainsandgrit.com/Grains Explorer. You can also sign up for the Grainy Bunch through there as well. And I look forward to the other grains that we have to explore for the rest of this year. We're already, oh my word, we're like halfway through. Halfway through 2024, y'all. Not okay with this, but there you go. So let me know in the comments below what you like to make with kamut or what you plan on trying out this month for this Grains Explorer Challenge. And if you ever do post your recipes or anything like that on social media, be sure to tag me. You can find me over at Instagram at Grains and Grit. Also use the hashtag Grains Explorer or hashtag Grains and Grit. I can see it there as well. Otherwise, hopefully this was a very informative and helpful video for y'all. Hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next week. Bye. July already, which means it's time to introduce a new grain for our Grains Explorer Challenge of 2024. This month, it's another ancient grain, also a gluten-free grain, and bonus, it's actually one of the more easily accessible grains. And this month, we're going to be talking all about quinoa. Hey y'all, welcome back to Grains and Grit. My name is Felicia, and on this channel, we talk all things real whole grains from a biblical perspective. So real quick, for those who are new, we are doing a Grains Explorer Challenge for 2024, where each month we dive deep into a new grain and explore the grain to broaden our horizons when it comes to all of the grains that we have available to us. To check out all the details of our Grains Explorer Challenge, be sure to just go to grainsandgrit.com/grainsexplorer. And do know that for the full adventure, extra recipes, videos, lively hangouts, so much more, be sure to actually be part of the Grainy Bunch, which is our exclusive member community that we have, and we have a lot of fun over there. And speaking of my grainies, we need to do a quick shout out to some of my grainies. So these are actually some of my newest grainies, so I just want to say hello to Juanita S., Pamela J., Kristen H., James B., Cindy M., Walt M., and Judy G. So you know who you are. Thank you so very much for being part of the Grainy Bunch. And also, if you want to catch up with all the months that we have done so far, be sure to check out the playlist up here to get all caught up. Now, as always, what we'll be covering in this video is 1, a general overview and history of quinoa. 2, the nutritional benefits. We are also going to dive into the types of quinoa because there are different types. Number 4 is what quinoa is used for, and some may be a bit of a surprise to you. And number 5, how to be using quinoa in your own home, how to cook it, tips and ideas, so on and so forth. Now, before we dive in, be sure to comment below. Let me know, have you tried quinoa? Do you like it? Do you hate it? Not know what to do with it? Let me know below. All right, so first up, just a general history and overview of this incredible tiny little grain. So as I mentioned, it is an ancient grain, but it is not from the Fertile Crescent like many of our beloved grains come from. It is actually from the South American area. So quinoa was first cultivated and was a main staple grain for the Incas, which predominantly lived in the Andes Mountains, as well as other indigenous people as well. But bottom line, this is a very old grain, 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, probably again soon right after the flood, and they realized, hey, this is a grain that can handle these harsh conditions living high altitudes and in the mountains. Now, along with maize or corn, potatoes, carrots, they also had these foods, but quinoa was definitely their main grain. So if you were of Incan descent, this is your ancient grain. Now from there, of course, if you know your history, the Spanish conquistadors came over and they did return to Europe with many of the foods that were from like that Central and South American area. But for some reason, quinoa just did not take off like corn did. When they brought over corn and potatoes and beans, those took off in Europe, but quinoa did not. And it's been speculated that because of the religious significance of quinoa, it was very significant to the Incans' religious ceremonies. It is possible that the Spanish, being Catholics, saw these pagans with their food and they didn't want anything to do with it. That is one theory. Another theory is they may not have realized that you actually do have to remove the outer layer because it actually is very bitter, which is something that is done. So whenever you buy quinoa in the store, that's already been removed. But it's actually, but if you don't remove it, the saponins, I think is how you say it, or saponins is how you say it. It's very bitter. So if they tried quinoa with that, probably didn't like it. We're not a fan. And then, of course, later on with the colonization of South America, Central and South America areas from the Europeans, they brought their own beloved grains such as wheat and barley, and those definitely became far more popular than quinoa. So it kind of died out in a bit. Only a very small bit of the population was actually growing quinoa, and it was mainly just the really poor farmers. So how is it now popular whenever it was such a marginal crop in South America? How is it that we have come to know of this amazing, incredible grain here in the United States and our Western countries? Well, that is many thanks to certain entrepreneurs and quinoa lovers in the 1970s and 1980s. In the 1970s, Steve Gorod is considered the quinoa evangelist, and many thanks to him, that is a big reason that quinoa has become such a popular grain in the United States. But bottom line, research actually came out that quinoa is a superfood, which we will get into the nutritional benefits later on why this is such an incredible grain. And because of that, it really took off between 2007 and 2013 in the United States. And actually, the United Nations designated 2013 as the year of quinoa. Now, of course, where it is grown, if you haven't guessed, predominantly Peru and Bolivia. That is pretty much where it's from, that South American Andes Mountain region. However, it is now grown in pretty much every continent except Australia these days because it has become a very popular grain due to the fact that it can be grown in very tough conditions. This is a very, very hardy grain. And so it's kind of been seen, and because of the nutritional benefits, it's been seen as something that can really help third world countries and these poorer nations to get not only nutritional food, but be able to grow it in maybe their harsh conditions. But at the time, about 80% of quinoa is from Peru and Bolivia, and some from Colombia as well. Here in the United States, if you want to know where it's able to be grown here, it does typically like a high elevation. And so right now it is pretty much being grown in the Rocky Mountains that extends from Colorado all the way up to Saskatchewan in Canada. Now let's get into the more sciencey parts of this grain. First of all, where the devil do we get the word quinoa? And this actually comes from an old Incan word, quinoa, which why we just don't call it that, I don't know, but there we go. So we pretty much stuck with it. We just basically spell it differently. The Incans also nicknamed this grain, and I'm probably about to butcher this pronunciation, but they actually nicknamed it Casaya Mama or Chisaya Mama. Not sure how to speak Incan, but this is it here on the screen. And what that actually means, if you guess correctly, is it means the mother of all grains, because to them, it was the mother of all grains. Even though they had corn and other food, this was definitely their main staple food. Another thing to know is that's actually not a true cereal grain like wheat and barley. It is called a pseudo cereal, right along with another grain that we've already studied in this Grains Explorer Challenge, Amaranth. And it is actually related to amaranth as well as spinach. And both the tiny seeds are eaten, as you probably know, but also the leaves can be eaten as well, very similar to spinach. So now let's get into the nutritional benefits, what makes quinoa the superfood that it is. And that is because, especially compared to other cereal grains, quinoa contains all the essential amino acids, which actually makes it a complete protein. And it's actually very high in protein as well. It's also, of course, very high in other things that whole grains are known for, such as the fiber, the B vitamins, the manganese, the phosphorus, potassium, calcium, zinc, copper, vitamin E, and a number of antioxidants as well. But as I stated, if you are vegan or vegetarian, this is definitely a good grain that you need to have on hand because it actually provides a complete protein and it's very high in protein. It can actually range from anywhere from 11 to 21%. And if those numbers mean nothing to you, let me break it down a bit further. To compare, rice is usually around 7.5%. Wheat is usually around 14%. To break it down even more, because this still probably means nothing to you, 1 cup of cooked quinoa actually brings in a whopping 8 grams of protein. So compare this to an egg. 1 egg gives you 6 grams of protein. So that's actually pretty amazing considering that this isn't an animal product. It is a plant food that you can really knock it out of the park with protein. Now, some people have stated that certain types of quinoa are higher in protein than others, but we'll get to that in a bit. Okay, so now we're going to get into the types of quinoa because there are a lot of types, just like there's a ton of types of rice. There's actually 120 different types of quinoa, and I'm not going to go through all 120. We're just going to cover the main 3 or 4 actually that you see. Technically the 4th one's not a type, but hold on. So the first type, of course, you have is white quinoa. This is the most common and the most versatile. It's the largest of the quinoa varieties, and it has a mild, grassy flavor and a creamy texture. The second one available is red quinoa. Red quinoa is chewier and smaller than white, but also with a nutty flavor. And then of course we have black quinoa, which has the most pronounced flavor and remains the firmest when cooked. And then not a different type, but you can also buy tricolor quinoa, which I actually do have. And I think it's the prettiest, and I love how it combines all three of those types. Now, as for which one is the most nutritious, I actually found conflicting information about this. Some people were saying red was better. Some people were saying black was better. So do the tricolor and then you get all three. But bottom line is, I think if you're just eating whole foods, whole grains, you'll be fine. Don't stress out about it. Now, side note, if you're wanting to know where to find quinoa, quinoa is easily found at the grocery store, but if you're wanting to branch out a bit and you can't find these other varieties, I actually got my regular white quinoa and my tricolor quinoa from Azure Standard. I will link them down below, and I will link any other places that I have available where you can buy this. But this is the great thing about quinoa is you can just buy it from your grocery store. All right, so what is quinoa used for? Obviously, you probably already know that the seeds are eaten as a grain. And I've already mentioned that the leaves can be consumed as well. They are typically eaten similar to spinach. But we also have some other uses. Remember those saponins, whatever they're called, that I mentioned earlier? Well, even though they're bitter and you definitely don't want to eat them, they actually have some industrial use that is used today. So again, this is the part that's on the very outside of the seed, and it is removed because it's just very bitter to taste. You do not want it, but it has been used in pharmaceuticals such as synthetic steroids and can be used in soaps, detergents, cosmetics, beer production, and fire extinguishers. So quite a wide range of how to use what we considered would be kind of a waste product. Cool beans. Okay, so how to use quinoa. There's actually multiple cooking techniques that I want to talk to y'all about because it's going to be based on your taste. Now, full disclosure, confession before I get into this. We are a whole grain family. We love whole grains. But unfortunately, my family is actually not a huge fan of quinoa. Now, it tastes good, and I'm still needing to experiment with it. I want to see if I can maybe win them over. Some yes, some no. But bottom line, it comes down to the texture, especially if you've got kids and they look at it and they instantly said, oh, look, frog eggs. So that's what my kids thought when they saw it for the very first time. They were wondering, why am I serving them frog eggs? Because legit, they look like frog eggs when you cook. It's completely legitimate. So do know this. The taste is really good. I actually like quinoa, but my family, like taste-wise, is good. But the texture thing may be something that some people may like and some people may not like. So forewarning and disclosure of that. So yes, I have found a grain that not all my family's on board, but I'm going to try this month to win them over. I'm going to try different things. So we will see. All right. So first, how to cook quinoa. And this is actually very simple. Just like with amaranth or any tiny little grain, you can just boil it as usual, but there are different techniques based on how you like it. Now, before you cook it, you typically do want to rinse your quinoa in a very fine mesh strainer because they are very, very tiny grains. And you typically just want to wash it to make sure that all those saponins are completely removed, because if you find you don't like the grain, maybe they need to be rinsed and you have that bitterness to them. So I do recommend rinsing this grain. Most people do as well. You might be able to find some that say they have been pre-rinsed, but go ahead and rinse them anyway. Just about a minute or two under the faucet in a fine mesh strainer, and you're good to go. And from there, after you've rinsed them, you need to decide whether you want fluffy, creamy, or firm quinoa. So if you want fluffy quinoa, for example, if you're wanting something similar to rice, it's basically a 2-to-1 ratio, 2 parts liquid to 1 part quinoa. So if you're doing 2 cups of liquid, you want 1 cup of quinoa. So you're gonna just add your liquid and your quinoa to a saucepan, big enough for however much you're cooking. And you're just gonna cook for about 12 to 15 minutes until it is done, until it is tendered and liquid has been absorbed. And I have a little tip later on to really tell you how to make sure that quinoa has been cooked. Then you just let it stand covered for about 5 minutes like you do with rice, kind of let it steam, and then enjoy. That's to get fluffy quinoa. To get creamy quinoa, you're gonna increase that liquid to about 2.5 to 1. So 1 cup of quinoa, 2.5 cups of your liquid. And do know this liquid can be water, it can be stock, broth, whatever you got on hand. You're then just gonna throw that all in, cover, bring it to a boil, let it simmer for about 20-25 minutes, and then covered, let stand for 5 minutes as well. Now, if you're wanting firm quinoa, which this may be more of what you want if you're wanting to throw it over a salad or something like that, you're just going to, once again, rinse your quinoa, add water to a pot. This is gonna be more like cooking pasta. So add however much water to a pot, bring it to a boil. When it is boiling, you're gonna add in your quinoa and you're gonna cook for about 12 to 15 minutes until tender. And then you're just gonna strain it all out. Again, like you do with pasta. Now, a few tips here to check for doneness. Quinoa has a cool little doneness factor that happens. And what happens is you're gonna look for the tails. Yes, the tails. So when quinoa is actually cooked all the way, you're actually gonna see the little tails come out like you're sprouting a grain. So if you've ever seen sprouting a grain, if you've ever sprouted grains, you're gonna see where that little sprout comes out. Quinoa does that whenever it's been cooked. So it's a cool little factor to know. And I'll try to show a picture up here, but I don't know if you're really gonna be able to see. This is some quinoa that I did in the Instant Pot. And so you might be able to see the tails, but you may just have to cook it to see what I'm talking about. Another thing is to know how much uncooked quinoa equals however much cooked quinoa. Do know this is deceptive because it's pretty much a 2-to-1 ratio. Whatever amount of quinoa that you cook, it's pretty much gonna double. So 1 cup of uncooked quinoa is gonna equal to about 2 cups of cooked quinoa. So do not do what I did the very first time I made quinoa for my family and thought, well, that's not enough. I'm going to triple this. That was a whole lot of quinoa, even for my big family. So be mindful with that 2-to-1 ratio. Whatever you uncooked quinoa, it's gonna double whenever it comes out cooked. So keep that in mind. Now, of course, how to use quinoa. And there are some things that you just need to be aware of the traits that this grain has, so you know what recipes to use it for. Of course, you can use it in place of rice. Whatever recipe calls for rice. I've even seen people make sushi with quinoa instead of rice. So you can just replace it with that because it honestly acts a lot like rice. Just again, the texture is obviously different than rice. So maybe a thing there, depending on how you like your texture. However, quinoa does not soak up liquids and sauces like other grains do, like barley and rice. So if you're wanting to throw it into something, expecting it to soak up liquids and stuff, like in soups or stews, no, it's not gonna do that like your starchier type grains. You can also grind it up into flour. I recommend just using a blender because it is such tiny of a grain and I'm not really sure. I haven't tried it in any of my grain mills yet, so I'm actually not sure how it works in a grain mill, but it is just so tiny. You could probably just throw it in your blender and blend it up that way. Quinoa can also be flaked. This is actually something that you can buy, is flaked quinoa. Pretty sure it's not gonna work in my flaker that I use for oats. So again, this may just be something you want to buy on your own. And I've seen people throw in flaked quinoa into cookies instead of like flaked oats. They're putting in flaked quinoa, so that's something to try as well. It can also be added cooked or raw to cookie dough. Again, something I haven't tried and I may not try because my family's already with the texture thing, but go ahead and try it. Let me know how it is. And you can also add it to like fritters and pancakes to add a little bit of that texture as well. All right, so there you go, y'all. Quinoa, superfood grain, very fascinating, has a fascinating history being that ancient grain. It's also, I did forget to mention, I mentioned at the very beginning, that it is a gluten-free grain. Duh. So for those of you who are gluten-free but are wanting grains, are wanting something that's going to give you that high protein, you're vegan, you're vegetarian, quinoa is certainly a great grain to have on hand. And again, it is one of the more easily accessible ones. And then be sure to check out the playlist over here to catch up on all of the grains that we have explored for 2024 so far. Let me know in the comments below how it's going for you. And as always, y'all have a great day. Bye. Welcome to August 2024, which means it is time to introduce a new grain for our Grains Explorer Challenge. And this month, it is another ancient grain that is also gluten-free and is most commonly known here in America as birdseed. Yes, you have probably seen it, but as birdseed. But it is a wonderful ancient grain, and that is millet. Hey y'all, welcome back to Grains and Grit. My name is Felicia, and on this channel we talk all things real whole grains from a biblical perspective. So this month we are going to be exploring the grain millet. This is part of our Grains Explorer Challenge that we are doing for 2024, which means every month we are exploring a new grain to broaden our horizons, to stretch our limits, to be introduced to grains that you may not be very familiar with. This is actually a grain that I have not tried myself, but yet has been sitting on my shelf for a very long time. Now, real quick before we begin, this challenge is for anyone and everyone, but for those of you who want to receive the full adventure, extra recipes, and more, be sure to join our exclusive community, The Grainy Bunch. We have a wonderful group of people, live hangouts every month. So just go to grainsandgrit.com/grainsexplorer to find out more about this challenge and also to sign up for the Grainy Bunch as well. And if you are new to this Grains Explorer Challenge, then be sure to check out the playlist up here to get caught up on all the grains that we have done so far and what we will be doing in the future. In this video, we're going to be exploring the grain millet. And as always, we will first be covering a history and general overview of the grain, the nutritional benefits, the types of millet that you can find, what millet is used for, and then finally, how you can use millet in your own kitchen. Before we begin, of course, let me know in the comments below, have you tried millet? Do you like it? Do you hate it? What are your favorite recipes? We all need to know all the things, so let us know in the comments. All right, so first up, a general history and overview of millet. Fascinating little grain and is considered to be one of the ancient of ancient grains. It is an ancient grain that dates back thousands of years. It's believed to come from East Asia, and archaeologists believe that it was actually the first grain of China about 1,000 years before rice hit the scene. There's a lot of references to millet through many, many different cultures. Chinese myths attribute millet domestication to Shennong, who is a legendary emperor of China, and Hu Ji, whose name means Lord of Millet. In fact, noodles made from millet were found in a Chinese tomb that dates back to about 4,000 years ago. And this is actually the oldest evidence of millet that has been found in China to date. We see that millet is mentioned in ancient biblical texts. We see it in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 4:9. And if that sounds familiar, that is because millet is listed as one of the grains used in the infamous Ezekiel bread recipe, which I have done before. So definitely be sure to try out Ezekiel bread to use millet this month. The ancient Greek poet Hesiod mentioned millet in one of his poems. Also, the ancient Greek philosopher Theophrastus, I probably butchered his name, sorry, who was actually the successor to Aristotle. He mentioned millet along with wheat in his text, Inquiry to Plants, written in 3rd century BC. I have to look at my notes for this one. Fan Shen Qi Shu was written in 2800 BC, and it lists millet as one of the 5 sacred Chinese crops. So bottom line, we definitely have a well-established history that millet has been around for a very long time and is an ancient grain that is through Asian cultures, India, and even into the Middle East. Today, it is grown in India, Nigeria, and other Asian and African countries. And the really cool thing about it, the reason why it's so popular, is it is very drought resistant. It can be grown in very harsh conditions. It doesn't need fertile soil. It can be grown in very poor soil. It's quite a resilient little plant. Probably why it's been around for thousands of years. India is currently the highest producer, producing about 38% of the world's millet, which is about triple that of the next countries in line. So they definitely are the prominent producer of millet. And finally, it is very similar to sorghum and is also in the same cereal family as wheat, barley, and rice. Next up, the nutritional benefits of millet. So as I already stated, it is a gluten-free grain, which is excellent for those people with celiac disease or those that truly need to stay away from gluten at all costs. This is a way to get a great whole grain in their diets without gluten. So as with all whole grains, it is very rich in fiber, both insoluble and soluble, which is good for your gut, good for your heart, good for your body. We all need fiber. We need all the things. So you will be getting fiber so long as you're consuming this as a whole grain. It is also very rich in protein and calcium and has more essential amino acids than other cereal grains. It is an excellent source of vitamin A, which, if you've been following me enough, that is actually slightly deficient in wheat. So this is a grain to have to counteract that slight deficiency. It's also very rich in B vitamins, phosphorus, potassium, antioxidants, and iron. Oh, and also niacin, which is a B vitamin. It's also a low glycemic index food, which is why on WebMD, they state that it actually is a very healthy whole grain for those with diabetes or needing to watch the foods that you eat that are going to spike your blood sugar. This means that it's not going to really spike that blood sugar. So again, like many whole grains, many benefits, but the key points with millet is that it is typically higher in calcium and rich in vitamin A as well. Now, types of millet. Now, there are about 6,000 varieties of millet, which is insane. But bottom line is they basically go into two categories. The first category is large or major millet, and the second category, you guessed it, is small or minor millet. Large or major millet is the most common. And in those, we have the most common in those categories. So in the large or major millet category, the most popular varieties are pearl, foxtail, proso, and finger or ragi millet. And in the small or minor millet categories, the most popular or common millets are kodo, barnyard, little, guinea, brown top, fonio, and adlay, or also known as Job's tears. Now, the most common that you will probably find sold for human consumption is pearl millet. And do know that with each of these varieties, they all have multiple colors that they come in as well. But probably whenever you go to buy millet, it's most likely going to be some type of pearl millet. But just know that all of these types of millets are great. They have excellent nutritional value and you receive all of the benefits with them. All right, so now what is millet used for? And it is used from animal food all the way up to human consumption as well. Fun fact, typically here in the United States, if you were buying birdseed, millet will probably be in it. And it's what a lot of people here in the United States associate millet with, is more birdseed. Thanks to the gluten-free movement, it has become more popular for human consumption, but generally speaking, people really were only using it as birdseed. Now, obviously, millet is predominantly used for food, which we will get to that in a bit on the ways that millet is used as food for humans. But other fun facts is it's also used like pretty much all grains. You know someone has made a liquor out of it or some sort of alcoholic drink. And sure enough, there is one where millet is the main grain that is distilled into a liquor called rakshi, and you find it in Nepal, India, as well as Tibet. It is a traditional food used in Russian, German, and Chinese cuisine. And you can generally find it in all forms. You can find it in just your typical whole grain millet. You can actually buy millet flour or mill it yourself, mill the millet yourself. See what I did there? And you can also find puffed millet, which leads us to how to use millet in your own kitchen. So first of all, it's like quinoa. If you're already familiar with quinoa, possibly rice or even amaranth, it's very similar to those. Now, how you actually just cook millet, just to cook up some millet, very simple. 2 cups water, 1 cup of millet. You put all that in a pot, you bring it to a boil, and then you bring it down to a simmer. Put a lid over it and simmer for about 15 minutes, 10-15 minutes, until most of the liquid has been absorbed by the millet. And then you remove it from the heat, keep the lid on, and like rice, you allow it to steam and that extra liquid to be absorbed, and there you go. You have an easy peasy cooked grain. Now, other ways to use it is that's one way to use it. If you're just needing some food really quick, just boil up some millet. You can make it into a porridge. Russians actually typically do that. It's to make millet into a porridge. They like it sweet or savory. You can also pop millet like popcorn. It does puff up, so similar to amaranth. You can just pop it and have that as a healthy snack. You can dress up a salad by just simply toasting the millet, just lightly toasting that millet, throw it into a salad. You can substitute it for a recipe that calls for quinoa. Of course, you can make the Ezekiel bread recipe, which I will be sure to have linked for y'all below. There's actually a popular Indian flatbread. It is a roti flatbread, but instead of wheat flour, it is all millet flour. Which do you know that in India, millet flour is actually known as Barley or Bajra flour. So if you see that in a recipe, that's just millet flour, just ground up some millet and you've got some flour. But this is actually a recipe that I plan to try myself. So again, it's just a roti bread, but with millet flour. You can use millet in granola recipes. You can just add it into muffins, throw it into a stew. Again, it's one of those tiny grains that are quite versatile. And I think if you just use a bit of imagination, you'll find many ways to use it. So let me know which one in the comments below that you actually plan on using millet for, or what you've already tried millet in. So again, this is a grain that I have not tried myself yet. So I definitely plan, I got to do it this month. I'm definitely going to do it. And anytime you make a recipe using either my recipes or if you're following us with the Grains Explorer Challenge, and be sure to tag me on social media. You can find me over on Instagram at Grains and Grit. But there you go with millet, exploring this grain. I look forward to this month. This is going to be stretching me as well. So again, if you want to catch up on the Grains Explorer Challenge, then be sure to check this playlist out here to get caught up on all the grains. grainsandgrit.com/grains explorer, and check out the Grainy Bunch because we got some pretty cool people over there. My Grainies, you know I love you and you're awesome. So hopefully this was helpful and I'll see you next week. Bye. All right, welcome to September Blink, and it's going to be 2025. It's time to introduce a new grain for our Grains Explorer Challenge that we are doing here in 2024. And this month, it's probably one of the most common ancient wheat varieties that is used, the easiest to work with, and the cheaper one of the ancient wheat varieties, and that is Spelt. Hey y'all, welcome back to Grains and Grit. My name is Felicia, and on this channel, we talk all things real whole grains, all from a biblical perspective. I teach you how to mill your own wheat, to bake with 100% freshly milled wheat, and more. So for those who are new to this video and this channel, we have a challenge going on for 2024. That is our Grains Explorer Challenge. And basically, we are exploring the world of grains, and I'm introducing a new grain each month, kind of challenging ourselves to work with a grain that we may not be as familiar with. Now, for the full adventure, I recommend signing up for the Grainy Bunch. My Grainies get extra recipes, we get monthly Zoom calls, and a great little community. So to check out all the information about our Grains Explorer Challenge, sign up for the Grainy Bunch, you just need to go to grainsandgrit.com/grains explorer, and be sure to check out the playlist up here to catch up on all the videos that you may have missed so far. All right, so as always, here's what we're going to cover on this video. 1, we're going to talk about a general overview and history of Spelt. 2, the nutritional benefits. 3, what Spelt is used for. And 4, how to use Spelt in your kitchen, and specifically how I like to use Spelt in my baking and cooking. So before we begin, be sure to comment below. Let me know, do you like Spelt? Have you tried it? What are your favorite recipes? Let us know all the things in the comments below. I also would like to say that I got a new cookbook. This is called Cooking with Ancient Grains by Laura McBride. And especially if you're interested in the ancient grains, she has excellent information about these grains. Some things I disagree with a little bit, but it's a massive cookbook. I think I got this from Azure Standard. I will link it for you below, especially if you were interested in ancient grains. And also she talks a lot about like the sprouting of the grains, using sprouted flour, things like that. So far it's been an interesting read. So check that out if you are interested in the ancient grains. So first of all, about Spelt, general overview and history of Spelt. It's pretty much a common consensus, although there is some disagreement, but bottom line, like many of our ancient grains, we basically trace it back to Mesopotamia, specifically the Fertile Crescent, known as the cradle of civilization. We do know from Bible times that is the location of the Garden of Eden, Abraham, where just modern civilization began, and we can trace Spelt all the way back there. It is typically believed that it's preceded only by emmer and einkorn, and that it generally is some sort of hybridized mix between emmer and some sort of wild wheat. So bottom line, it's wheat. Okay, Spelt is wheat. Don't worry about getting into the whole genetics of it, but it is just one of those wheats that trace back for thousands of years. It actually was most popular from pretty much the Bronze Age all the way through medieval times. So it used to be a very common wheat Not so much anymore now. We'll get to that later. It is mentioned in Roman poetry, in Dante's Inferno, in Greek mythology. It's believed that it was given, Demeter gave spelt for harvesting to human beings. And spelt is mentioned in the Bible, depending on what version you're using. And I actually encourage you to do a little bit of a Bible study with that because it's kind of interesting. 800 years ago, Hildegard von Bingen, sorry if I mispronounced that, known as Saint Hildegard to Catholics, and she also is generally considered to be the founder of scientific natural history in Germany. Here's what she said about spelt way back in like the early 1100s. The spelt is the best of grains. It is rich and nourishing and milder than other grains. It produces a strong body and healthy blood to those who eat it, and it makes the spirit of man light and cheerful. If someone is ill, boil some spelt, mix it with egg, and this will heal him like a fine ointment. So I find this interesting that Hildegard is German because spelt is actually quite popular in Germany, and it has been for quite some time. In fact, in Germany, it's actually known as Dinkel, which I know is a funny name, but that's what it's called in German. But you may know it as another name because in Italy, it is known as farro. Now, one thing to know is spelt. It is wheat, thus it is a gluten grain. This is not a gluten-free grain. However, people say that it's different gluten than our modern wheat varieties, but I have a theory about that. We'll get to it in a minute. Just hold on. So even though spelt was extremely popular for a very, very long time, it actually declined in popularity in our modern times, mainly due to how modern agriculture is. The difference between spelt and our typical modern wheats is it comes down to how it's harvested. The reason why it's declined is because now with our modern tractors and combines, how most wheat is harvested nowadays is when the farmers go out to harvest in the fields. It is also threshing the wheat and removing that outer husk all in one fell swoop. Boom, and it's done. Spelt is not like that. It is a bit more difficult to remove that outer hull, and so it has to be harvested in the fields, and then it has to have, through step number 2, to actually have that hull removed mechanically. And because it's a 2-step process, not 1-step process, that is what makes it a bit more expensive. If you can do things in one fell swoop, that's going to make things faster and cheaper. So even though spelt is still grown and used today, that's why it's not as easily found than our typical modern varieties. So while it was popular in Europe for a while, it actually didn't make it over to the United States until about the 1890s. But again, was not really able to compete whenever modern agriculture kind of got started. But it actually has gained popularity now due to a lot of different factors. But the main thing is it's now being stated that spelt is easier to digest. It's easier on those with gluten sensitivities, so on and so forth. Now, here's where we get into Felicia opinion based on all that I know about grains. Every time I look about spelt, when I was researching about spelt over and over again, I was seeing, oh, spelt, it's easier to digest. It's better for those with gluten sensitivities than our modern wheats. However, if you are not new here, you've heard me say this before, it is not the wheat, it is the flour. So most of the time when you are buying an ancient grain flour, be it spelt, or Einkorn or Kamut, most of the time you're actually buying it in its whole grain form. So they generally grind it up. They don't sift it. They're not making white flour, although you can find white flour varieties. But I was finding that generally it is sold in more of its whole grain form, as opposed to our modern wheat. When you go and buy flour, most of the time it is dead white flour. So if you're comparing the flours, then yeah, because white flour has no nutrients in it really. So if you're comparing just white flour that is made of our modern wheats next to a spelt flour that is still whole grain, then yes, that spelt flour is going to be better than your dead white flour. But I believe if you are milling your own grain, so even if it's modern grains, our hard red, our hard white, our soft white wheats, even being modern grains, if you were consuming it whole, if you were milling it yourself and baking that bread, most likely you're not really going to notice a difference between that and spelt, other than how it works while baking. But from a nutritional level, from a digestibility level, I think the key is just milling your own grains yourself. Again, it's not the grain, it's the flour that's been messed with. So make sure your flour is good. And as always, the best is to mill your own grains, because even if you're buying spelt flour, even if it's in a whole grain form, remember just in 3 days of milling those grains, 90% of nutrients have been oxidized. You still get the fiber benefits, but that vitamin E is pretty much gone, and other nutrients that oxidize, it's just not there. So while it's better than buying white dead flour, mill it yourself, and mill it whenever you need it for the best nutritional benefits. Which leads us to number 2, the nutritional benefits of spelt. And this one is actually very interesting. So like any whole grain, spelt is an excellent source of carbohydrates and fiber. And it's also particularly rich in iron, magnesium, phosphorus, B vitamins, and zinc. Again, these are things that are very common across multiple different whole grains, even our modern wheat, so long as it is whole grain. Now, let's compare it to modern wheats typically. And this, I did find a little bit of conflicting information. So all depends on the source that you're looking at. But overall, I was seeing that spelt is a bit higher in protein content than other wheats. So not by much, 15.6% protein content in spelt, as opposed to around like 14.9% in our typical wheats. Again, it depends on the wheat. Some are higher, some are lower in protein. This does not translate to gluten formation. Modern wheats typically are a bit better with that gluten formation. Spelt's a little bit trickier, but as far as protein goes, spelt's a little bit higher. It also has a little bit higher fat content at 2.5% compared to 2.1%. And the fiber is where I was seeing the conflicting information, because some sources were saying that it was higher in fiber than typical wheat. Some sources were saying it was lower in fiber, and then other sources said that there was just no contrast at all. So bottom line, consume whole grains. Whole grains are very good in fiber, so don't get hung up. But I think the hard red wheat generally reigns as far as fiber goes, but it's not that huge of a difference. Just consume whole grains. Okay, so what is spelt used for? Unlike the other grains that we have looked at, there's really not any fancy, crazy off-the-wall uses. Some grains that we have studied so far are used in pharmaceuticals or other types of uses, not really for spelt. It's predominantly used for your typical baking and cooking, usually used as a flour. But fun fact, like many of the wheat and other grains, of course there are alcoholic uses for it. And there are some that use spelt today. So there actually is a spelt vodka. The brands like Distilleries First and V1 make a 100% organic vodka. There's also spelt beer. This is mainly whenever you find it in, for those who like to brew their own beers, home brewers, you can use spelt. And there actually are breweries in Bavaria, which is South Germany, and also Belgium, that actually prefer to use spelt to brew their own beer. And last but not least, some American spirits, such as premium spelt whiskey, are, you guessed it, made with spelt. So if you ever get your hands on these and you try them and you actually are used to consuming these type of spirits and alcohol, let me know in the comments below if you can notice any sort of difference. All right, so now my favorite part. How to use spelt in your kitchen and my favorite ways to use spelt. So fun fact is, as far as the ancient grains go, spelt was my first ancient grain of the wheat varieties that I ever used. So a little tip about using spelt is it actually sometimes does not need as much liquid as other wheat varieties. So whenever you use it and convert recipes yourself, you may find that you need about a quarter less of your liquid. But it kind of all depends. You may need to experiment. I actually do want to experiment with a 100% freshly milled spelt bread recipe. And so if I have that up, I will link that up in the description box for y'all. I hope to have that up soon. But otherwise, as far as your baking and cooking, spelt can be switched out for regular wheat flour at a 1-to-1 ratio for the most part. But again, it's not as strong of a gluten as like a hard red or hard white wheat. So you may find a little bit of tweaking is needed there, or, it just may not turn out like your typical hard red or hard white wheat breads do. But Spelt is also very versatile, where you can switch it between your lighter baked goods like cookies, brownies, and also your yeast breads, where I wouldn't necessarily cross the two with your hard wheats. Now, my favorite thing to use Spelt is that it's actually pancakes and waffles. Spelt pancakes and waffles are amazing. And I have those recipes for you down below. You'll notice that it calls for, hard white, soft white, whatever. Use the same amount of Spelt that's called for in the recipe. I've never really noticed a difference with the water, so keep the liquid the same. And these are so good. Like, especially this, it gives such a wonderful nutty type flavor, but not an overwhelming like whole wheat flavor, and it's still kind of light. So definitely try it out. Pancakes and waffles are my favorite thing to use Spelt. They also do great in muffins as well, and I do recommend these recipes would be the easiest for beginners. So if you're wanting to dip your toe in the ancient grains, Spelt is the easiest ones to use, in my opinion. And then with these recipes, they're actually even easier than attempting an entire yeast loaf. Spelt is also used in my Ezekiel bread recipe, which I have it for the bread machine or for the oven. Links below, which really reminds me I need to update my Ezekiel bread recipe video because I have tweaked some things in that recipe. Now, whenever I want to make a yeast bread, my favorite combination is about 2/3 hard red wheat to 1/3 Spelt. And using that combination gets me a nice, beautiful loaf. That hard red really helps that. But the flavor with the Spelt and the hard red is absolutely delicious and amazing. And that Spelt kind of softens that hard red a little bit. And it just gives a really, really good flavor. I've never gone up to 50-50. I've always used just a little bit more hard red. So again, my simple yeast bread loaf recipe will be listed below. I will link it for y'all below, and just try this combination out. So just 2 parts hard red, 1 to 1 part Spelt. So 2/3 hard red, 1/3 Spelt is kind of that ratio. And you can just mill it all at once, mix it all together. But I find that it is so good, and you definitely need to try it. So there you go with Spelt. Let me know if you learned something new, and in the comments, let me know how you like to use Spelt yourself. And for those of you who want to learn more about the Grains Explorer Challenge, then be sure to check out this playlist here, catch you up on all the videos that we've done for the Grains Explorer Challenge. And if you're wanting to check out that Ezekiel bread recipe, then you need to check that out here. Easy way to use Spelt as well as a ton of other grains. And as always, I hope you'll have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next week. Bye. If you love your beer, whiskey, and or those hearty German and Russian dark breads, then you're really going to love the grain that we are exploring for this month in October 2024 for our Grains Explorer Challenge. And that is another ancient grain, and it is rye. Hey y'all, welcome back to Grains and Grit. My name is Felicia, and on this channel, we talk all things real whole grains from a biblical perspective. I teach you all about milling your own wheat, baking with whole grains, using them in your kitchen, using real whole foods, all the things. So if that's your jam, be sure to subscribe, like this video, all the things. So this is actually another video here in October for our Grains Explorer Challenge for 2024. And fun fact, I'm actually filming this while Hurricane Helene is bearing down on us here in Florida. But the show must go on. That's how much I love you guys. So we're hurricane prepping, but I got to film this video. And I'm really hoping that I don't look back on this and think, wow, if we only knew. So praying for all my Floridians out there, and praying that by the time this video comes out that we will recover and everything will be fine. Okay, so if you're new, our Grains Explorer Challenge is a challenge that we have going on here for 2024, where we are challenging ourselves to use a new grain each and every month. And so this month is rye. And if you want to catch up on other grains that we have covered so far, then be sure to check out this playlist up here. Anyone can join this challenge, but to receive the full adventure, that is for my Grainy Bunch. You know I love you, my Grainies. Y'all are awesome. And they receive extra recipes, Zoom hangouts every month. We have a lot of fun. And so be sure to check that out. Just go to grainsandgrit.com/grainsexplorer in order to check out all the details with this Grains Explorer Challenge. And you can sign up for the Grainy Bunch while you're there as well. Now, as always, here's what we will cover in this video. 1, we will cover the history and overview of rye. Number 2, the nutritional benefits. Number 3, all the uses that rye can be used for. And number 4, my favorite ways to use rye in my kitchen, how to use rye, and ideas that I'm going to be trying out myself this month in October. Before we begin, comment below. Have you ever used rye before? What are your favorite things to use rye for? What do you think about it? Are you going to be trying it this month yourself? Let me know in the comments below. All right, first up, the history and overview of rye. Now, in case you didn't know, rye is definitely part of the same type of cereal grains and very closely related to wheat and barley. And it is very much an ancient grain, but being an ancient grain does not mean that it's gluten-free. This is definitely a gluten grain, although the gluten is a bit different and it's not gonna be as much of a rise as wheat. Now, as far as the origins of rye, this is kind of a bit of a controversy, but pretty much they have settled that the origins of rye is from modern day Turkey. And the main reason that this is kind of up for debate is because unlike wheat and barley and other type of grains, it's actually difficult to determine whether this rye grain is domesticated or if it's the wild rye grain. The wild rye and the domesticated rye are actually very, very similar and barely change at all. So when archaeologists are looking back and they find rye grain in archaeological sites, it's kind of hard to tell if it's just wild grain that has come in or if they were actually domesticating and growing this rye. So we don't really have a lot of history as far as ancient times go, but we do know come by the Middle Ages that rye was definitely starting to become more popular. And it mainly gained that popularity due to its ability to be grown in poor soil, such as sandy soil, and also in cold climates as well. And in fact, rye can actually be grown today as far north as the Arctic Circle and in high altitudes, poor conditions where you can't really do that with wheat and barley as well. Come the 12th and 13th centuries, rye definitely became a very popular grain in modern day Central Europe. And it actually was still the main grain of Germany until after World War II. Now today we actually have what is known as the rye belt. And this is where most of the rye in the world is grown. And the rye belt, as you can see here on this map, is predominantly grown in North and Eastern Europe. For example, Germany, Poland, the Nordic countries, the Baltic countries, Belarus, Ukraine, Austria, Czech Republic, and Slovakia. Now, we also do grow some of the rye here in the United States and also in Canada. So most likely if you're buying over here on across the pond, across the Atlantic Ocean, you probably will be buying grains grown here in the US and Canada because it's here and it's cheaper. So you can always tell that whenever you're buying rye grain, it usually tells you where it is originated from. I did check Azure Standard, for example, and their rye is sourced from the US and Canada. Now, another fun fact is because wheat and rye and barley are all so closely related, they actually did come up with a hybrid grain, which is a mix of wheat and rye. So they took wheat and rye and they hybridized them into what is known as triticale, which is something that you can purchase. So you might have seen this out whenever you've gone to buy grains and wondered what triticale is. And all that is a hybrid between wheat and rye. Now, rye, of course, is not as popular as your typical wheat. And in fact, as far as all these type of cereal grains go in the world, only 3% of the population of this wheat family, only 3% is actually rye. So it's a very small percentage. It's not as popular, but still a great grain. Now, one downside to rye is it is actually very susceptible to a fungus known as ergot. And this actually created a problem. And this is not cool. Like if your rye becomes infected with ergot, you don't want it because it can cause death. It can also cause gangrene in the fingers and in the toes, vomiting, diarrhea, headaches. It ain't good. It is not cool. And in fact, it was such a problem that back in the Middle Ages, they would frequently have pandemics because the rye grain was being infected with this fungus and people were dying. In fact, it was known as St. Anthony's fire, which you may have heard of before, and it was no good at all. But good news, Due to screening methods today, it actually is very rare because modern technology, we have gotten better at screening these grains to make sure that the rye is not infected with this fungus. But just know that today it is called ergotism, ergotism. That is the name of it if you do somehow get rye that's infected with this. It can also be found in wheat and barley as well. It's not just to rye. It's more rye is more susceptible to this. So just know, buy from reputable sources. Make sure your grains are clean, and you should be just fine. Okay, so next up, the nutritional benefits of rye. And again, if you already know the benefits of typical wheat and barley and or whole grains in general, it's pretty much the same. Rye is very high in fiber. It is rich in those B vitamins and the trace minerals such as iron, manganese, phosphorus, and selenium. The protein content is around 15%. But as usual, it's a whole grain. So if you're eating it in its whole grain form, which most of the time, rye flour, if you buy the rye flour, most likely it is in more of a whole grain form. But of course, here on this channel, I always say you should be milling it and milling it yourself whole and intact, and at least consuming the rye berries whole and intact the way the good Lord intended. But it is still a very nutritious grain, just like wheat and barley and our other beloved whole grains. Now the fun part, what rye is used for. And this is one of those grains that have a ton of uses. Now, obviously, it is used in our beloved dark breads. Those are your pumpernickels, your dark Russian rye breads. And of course, we know it more in the United States. Over here, the Westernized, they lightened it up for us, where they usually mix it in with some wheat to make it a lighter bread, but that's where you still get your typical rye breads that are a bit whiter on that side. So it's a very common bread. I'm sure we've all had a turkey sandwich on rye at a deli or something like that. So these are wonderful. And fun fact, the dark breads, those dark pumpernickels, those dark Russian ryes are actually my husband's favorite type of bread. And I do not make it enough. I will be making it today. After this video, I'm going to make one for him. And I'm also making a German potato salad because he wants a German beer to go with it. And so I'm going to be making him that today. But every time I make it, he always says I don't make it enough. So gonna make it, but that's actually his favorite types of bread. Now, other uses is light wheat and barley. You know, fermented drinks have been made from rye. This includes beers like the Roggen beer in Germany, which is made about 60% of rye. It's Bavarian craft beer. There's also a Finnish beer made with rye called Sahti. I hope I pronounced that right. And then there's also kvass, which if you have the Nourishing Traditions cookbook by Sally Fallon, the Weston A. Price Foundations, you may have heard of beet kvass, which is made from beets, but there also is just kvass, the traditional drink that is made by fermenting rye bread, which I will admit, I'm probably never going to try. Like, yeah, full disclosure, probably not going to try that one myself. If I do, I might leave it to the professionals, but I don't think I'm going to try that one. But if you do have the Nourishing Traditions cookbook, that is actually on page 595 if you would like to try it yourself. There's also some Japanese craft beers that use rye, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce those because I will butcher that. And of course, some whiskeys and vodkas are also made from rye grain as well. Other uses is, of course, our animal feeds. You're probably very familiar with this if you purchase animal feed. Rye is a very popular one. Rye is also used as a cover crop. And in fact, if you live in farm country and you see something like wheat grown, but maybe wheat isn't grown in your area, it actually may be rye. It's a very popular cover crop because it has roots that go deep and stay tight together. So it's an excellent way to keep your soil healthy. And in fact, I've seen it grown around here in Florida myself. And with that, it is a good soil improvement by just tilling that into the ground. It helps amend the soil. Other uses is the tough fiber straw of rye is used in thatches, hats, mattresses, and paper. Rye is also used in wallpaper, corrugated packaging materials, and plywood. In fact, rye flour is used as an adhesive in the production of those type of goods. There's also one in the chemical world. I'm going to have to look at my notes, and that is furfural. Furfural. Here it is on the screen. And it's a pinosan component of rye, and it's used to make furfural, which is a starting material for many industrial chemicals. And again, just very, very versatile grain. You can, of course, just make up some rye and just cook up some rye and eat it whole. Just many, many uses for rye. Which leads us to the final one, is how I like to use rye in my kitchen and what I will be doing this month for this challenge when it comes to rye. Now, I'm not crafting any beers around here, and I'm also not starting my own distillery, although that would be super cool, not doing that. So my use of rye is predominantly bread related. As I mentioned, my husband loves the dark breads. And if you have Sue Becker's Home Ground Flour Cookbook, I do recommend the Black Russian Rye bread that is found on page 156. I still want to kind of see about tweaking this recipe a little bit, but ultimately that is a good recipe. My husband absolutely loves this bread, and so do my kids. It's just really, really good if you're wanting those dark breads. It is delicious. I also have yet to actually get a good typical rye bread down. So I would like to try that this month. That is something that you can do as well. And if I figure it out, I will certainly share the recipes. I also would like to do the Outback Steakhouse pumpernickel style bread using 100% freshly milled wheat and rye. So I want to do that as well. I have some recipes to try. I believe Michael Gropp has a recipe for that. So if she does, I will link it down below, put it up here on the screen if I can, so you can check that out while I'm experimenting with it as well. Now, one thing that I was seeing that I haven't tried is that you can roll rye like you do oats. I'm pretty sure I can do that. I was seeing where some you have to heat it up, which I don't have the ability to do, and then do that. So I kind of want to experiment with rolling the rye grains, because it makes a very popular porridge, or adding it into oats, kind of making that a bit different. Now, if you're just wanting to cook rye grain, because you can just cook up the rye wheat berries and add it into salads, or if you want to use it in a soup or something like that, here's the ratio up here on the screen. And the ratio is generally 4 parts water to 1 part of the whole rye wheat berries. So if you soak it overnight, then these will take about 45 minutes to an hour to cook. If you do not soak it, then it can take 2 to 3 hours to actually cook up these grains. So like any grain, throw it in some boiling water. When it gets to boil, then simmer it until it's cooked. I mean, no need to overthink this. So I have to go and make up this Russian rye bread for supper tonight, get started on that potato salad, but that is rye. So let me know if you learned anything new. Check out the past videos that we have done. There's a whole playlist with all the grains so you can catch up on. And then check it out, grainsandgrit.com/grains explorer challenge to all my grainies. Be on the lookout for those extra recipes coming your way. And as always, I hope y'all have a wonderful day, and I'll see y'all next week. Bye. It's November, holiday, Thanksgiving, all of those things are coming up, but it's still time for another grain for our Grains Explorer Challenge that we are doing in 2024. And I have to say, this month we're probably looking at our most unique grain, because not only is it an ancient grain, it actually originates from Asia, but it's not rice. It's a gluten-free grain, and despite its name, it's not a wheat. It's actually more related to things like rhubarb. This month, it's all about buckwheat. Hey y'all, welcome back to Grains and Grit. My name is Felicia, and on this channel, I teach you all things real whole grains from a biblical perspective. I teach you why you should be consuming real whole grains, what they are, how to mill your wheat, how to mill your grains, bake that delicious bread, and more. So if that's your jam, be sure to subscribe to this channel and hit the little bell icon to be notified of future videos. For those of you who are new, we are exploring a new grain each and every month for 2024. It's in our Grains Explorer Challenge. Each and every month, I introduce you to the grain that we are focusing on for that month. And anyone can join along, but for the full adventure, be sure to sign up for the Grainy Bunch. This is my exclusive membership group. I love you, my grainies. Y'all are absolutely amazing. And my grainies get extra recipes, extra videos, live monthly Zoom calls, and private MeWe group, and more. So if you're wanting to dive even deeper and maybe want to connect with fellow grain lovers, then be sure to just go to grainsandgrit.com/grainsexplorer to find out about the Grains Explorer Challenge and also to sign up for the Grainy Bunch as well. Also, if you are new to our Grains Explorer, be sure to check out the playlist up here to catch up on all the grains that we have explored this year so far. Now, as always, what we will cover in this video is, first of all, an overview and history of buckwheat. Number 2, the nutritional benefits. Number 3, how buckwheat is typically used. And number 4, how I plan on using buckwheat in my kitchen and ideas for using it in yours. First off, please comment below. Let me know if you have experience with buckwheat. Do you like it? Do you hate it? What do you plan on trying this month? Let me know in the comments below. All right, so first up, history and overview of buckwheat. As I stated, it is an ancient grain. Archaeologists date it back to Asia, specifically China, and I've kind of seen conflicting source, whether it's like Southwest or Northeast China, but bottom line is buckwheat does date back to China roughly about 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. I mean, we're going all the way back. It is then documented in Europe around the 14th and 15th centuries, eventually made its way over to the US in about the 17th century. And it was actually quite a popular grain here in the United States until the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. Because of the Industrial Revolution, better fertilizers came out, and because people were discovering these fertilizers, other crops like wheat and maize, which need good fertilization, they became a bit more popular. And to give y'all a little bit of perspective, in 1918, here in the United States, over 1 million acres were producing buckwheat, and that died off pretty quickly to the 1950s, where only about 150,000 acres were growing and cultivating buckwheat. Now, it has been regaining popularity despite its name because, you know, it is a gluten-free grain thanks to the gluten-free craze. Buckwheat and other gluten-free grains have been making a comeback. Another cool thing is that it can be grown in a variety of climates. From what I was seeing, is pretty much anyone can grow buckwheat. However, it actually does best in cool, moist climates, but it can handle subpar soil. It's also fairly easy to grow. It doesn't really need pesticides or fertilizers, and it's fast. It matures just within 30 days. So from whenever you plant it to harvesting, that's only 30 days compared to several months that it takes for other crops like wheat and corn. Now, it can be killed by frost, and high temperatures can cause it to just not produce very well. And of course, it is susceptible to drought because of its short root system. Hence, you know, where it grows in just 30 days. Well, that's a short root system, so it is a bit more susceptible to drought. Okay, so buckwheat. Wheat is in the name, but it's not related to wheat at all. So where in the world did it get its name? And this is actually quite fascinating. We actually have the Dutch to thank for that. It got its name from the way that it looks. As you can see here, it's a really unique looking grain. It's very pyramid, kind of like a pyramid in its shape, but it actually got its name because it resembles the seed of a beech tree. And the Dutch called it, and I'm probably gonna slaughter the pronunciation, Buckwheat. Buckwheat? I don't know if it's like German. Buckwheat. If you speak Dutch, let me know how to pronounce it in this description. This is how it is spelled, which means it is translated as beech wheat. So, pretty cool. As stated, it's not related to wheat, but more like related to rhubarb and sorrel and knotweed. But it is considered a pseudo-cereal like amaranth and quinoa because of its ability to be basically ground into flour like wheat or made into a cereal like wheat, hence the name pseudo-cereal. So who actually grows buckwheat? And this is very interesting because if you love buckwheat, this may be a problem for you here in the United States because the number one producer, the number one grower of buckwheat is actually Russia, coming in at a whopping 55% of the buckwheat that was grown and sold in the entire world in 2022. Followed number 2 by China at 23%, and then the Ukraine at 7%. And if you've been following politics lately in the past couple of years, Russia and Ukraine are kind of at war with each other. So I actually haven't looked, and I'm kind of curious to see how that's affecting buckwheat production right now. I don't know, but also on the flip side, the United States is the number 4th producer. Predominantly, it is grown here in the United States in New York, Pennsylvania, North Dakota, Washington, and Minnesota. So we do grow it here in the United States, which is probably a good thing because otherwise it would be extremely expensive right now because of the geopolitical type issues going on, and we would be importing all of it. So we do actually produce it here in the United States. But ironically, even though we do produce it in the United States, most of our buckwheat is actually exported to Japan. And we'll get into the reason why later. So that brings us up to the nutritional benefits of buckwheat. As I stated, it is a gluten-free grain. So for those of you who may be needing gluten-free type grains, this is an excellent one to have. But it's also just like any whole grain, meaning it's going to be great in high fiber, in magnesium, phosphorus, your B vitamins, copper, all of those things. Just generally the benefits that we receive from whole grain, so long as it's used in its whole grain form. Now, buckwheat is actually very rich in an antioxidant known as rutin, which is very great. It's a great anti-inflammatory. But bottom line, it's a great grain. God designed it to be nutritious and wholesome for our good, and yet another great grain to just include in a well-balanced diet. All right, number 3, what is buckwheat typically used for? And I have to say I was a little surprised by some of these uses. Obviously, the first use is in food. People eat and consume buckwheat. If you are actually a fan of the Little House on the Prairie series, you may have actually heard of buckwheat because in the book, The Long Winter, we actually see and read about Almanzo making buckwheat pancakes. And as I stated earlier, that before the Industrial Revolution, buckwheat was actually a very popular grain here in the United States. And so that's why we see these older recipes where they were making things like buckwheat pancakes. It's also a very popular form of porridge known as kasha in Eastern Europe. The French love buckwheat crepes, so that's something to definitely try. In India, buckwheat is known as something I'm going to have to look at, kutu ka atta, and is associated with many festivals. And the reasons why many of our buckwheat is actually exported to Japan is because the Japanese love these noodles called soba noodles that are made from buckwheat. And yes, I've actually researched to see if we can actually make these type of noodles at home. And from what I was seeing is that can be quite tricky and weird to do. So many recipes that you might find where making soba noodles at home do not do 100% buckwheat. They do about 20% of wheat flour to make it a little bit easier. So I suggest if you want pure buckwheat soba noodles, you may want to leave it up to the professionals, but go ahead and try it. I probably won't, but feel free to try it and let me know how it turns out. And then of course, buckwheat, of course, you could grind it into flour, and grinding it into flour means you can use it as a flour. Like I said, the pancakes, the waffles, adding it in, maybe mixing it into a muffin recipe. There's many, many uses. When you can grind up a grain, lots of things can happen. It's also used as a cover crop. And in fact, bees love buckwheat, and it produces a very unique type of honey. So if you are a beekeeper, may want to try growing some buckwheat for your bees that you love so much and see how that honey turns out. And also, being a cover crop helps to put nutrients back into the soil as well. Now, it is a gluten-free grain, so buckwheat is actually used in gluten-free beers as well as whiskeys because of its gluten-free aspect. Now, the whiskeys are generally produced in the US and France, and then in Japan, they have a distilled drink known as shoku, I think is how you pronounce it, a distilled drink made from buckwheat. There are also different types of teas in China, in Korea, and Japan. I will kind of list that here on the screen, the names of them, so I do not slaughter the pronunciation. And the most surprising use of buckwheat is actually in pillows. Yes, there is a market for having pillows with buckwheat hulls in them, and they state that it's good for those who may be allergic to feathers. If you like feather pillows, those, if you have allergies, this is a kind of more allergy-free one, so long as you're not allergic to buckwheat. But I've also seen advertisements where they say that because of the buckwheat hulls, it's better with your spinal alignment, helping you sleep better. So I found that very fascinating. All right, last but not least, how to be using buckwheat in your kitchen. As I stated, probably the easiest way to do it and to start off with is grind it up into flour and use it in pancakes. Now, I will say, I have tried this before with my pancake recipe, which is a buttermilk pancake recipe. Wasn't a fan. Okay. Just I might need to try it again. I may need to tweak my recipe, maybe not using buttermilk. All I know is it just wasn't a fan. So if you have made buckwheat pancakes, please share your recipe in the comments below, because all I know is we weren't a fan of mine, but I need to try again. So I'm going to try it again. Another easy way is to make kasha. It's just a porridge, y'all. It's a traditional type of porridge. Now, do know that it actually is toasted. So generally how kasha is made is you need to lightly toast your buckwheat groats. So the whole buckwheat, just lightly toast them on about medium heat for about 45 minutes until they're light and golden brown. And then you basically just add 1 cup of the buckwheat groats to about 1 3/4 cups of water. Add in maybe around a teaspoon of salt, 1 tablespoon of butter, and then just bring it up to a simmer and let it simmer until it's done, which usually can be anywhere from 18 to 25 minutes. You can choose to add more butter if you want, add a little bit more salt to your taste, whatever you're wanting to do. But that's a super easy way, and it's a very common and popular porridge in Eastern Europe. Again, kasha. You can also use it to make waffles, crepes. Like I said, the French love buckwheat crepes. Again, grind it up to flour, probably just make it like normal crepes. There are just, again, so many uses. You may be able to use it in a granola recipe. I don't know because of the shape and the way the grain is, but you may be able to. You let me know. But bottom line is this just, again, another great whole grain to add to your grain arsenal. And there you have it, y'all. That is an introduction to buckwheat. Let me know again in the comments below what your favorite recipes are. Share those recipes so we can know them as well. And if you're not a member of the Grainy Bunch, be sure to go check it out. Just grainsandgrit.com/grainsexplorer to find out more about the Grains Explorer Challenge. I cannot believe we have 1 more month left, and next month is Einkorn. I saved one of the most popular ones for last. So be sure to check out this playlist over here with all the videos with our Grains Explorer recipe. And I hope that y'all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next week. Bye. If there's a grain out there that had a bit of a cult following, it is definitely this month's grain for our Grains Explorer Challenge, our very last one of the year. It's another ancient grain that has become very popular, but frankly, there's a bit of misinformation out there about it. Which means that I'm going to be correcting some of that, which means I'm probably going to be lighting a bit of a fire in the comment section below. We're going to be diving in deep today to finding the truth about one of these most beloved ancient grains, Einkorn. Hey y'all, welcome back to Grains and Grit. My name is Felicia, and on this channel, we talk all things real whole grains from a biblical perspective. I teach you how to be milling your wheat, your other grains, consuming whole grains, how to bake your bread, how to cook with whole foods, all of that stuff. That's your jam. Be sure to subscribe to this channel. Now, as I mentioned, this is another video for our Grains Explorer Challenge, and it's our last one here for 2024. This is the final video for our Grains Explorer Challenge, where this year, every single month, we have been exploring a different grain to help us expand our horizons and to learn more and dive deep into one particular grain for that month. And as I stated, this month's grain is Einkorn. I saved one of the most requested ones for last. Now, anyone can join this Grains Explorer Challenge, but for the full adventure, you gotta check out the Grainy Bunch. My Grainies are an awesome bunch of people. They are diehard fans, and they actually get the full adventure. So the Grainy Bunch actually receives extra recipes. We do Zoom video calls every month, which is a lot of fun to be able to see y'all face to face. You also have access to me, more personal access to me. So when you ask questions, I'm able to answer them a lot faster, and they are the ones who get the priority for me. And we just have a lot of fun. They get extra recipes, bonus content, and more. So be sure to check out the Grains Explorer Challenge. Just go to grainsandgrit.com/grainsexplorer. That's also where you can find out more about the Grainy Bunch and sign up there as well. And if you are new to our Grains Explorer Challenge and you want to catch up on all the grains that we have done for 2024, then be sure to check out this playlist up here. As usual, we will be covering 1, a general overview and history of Einkorn. Number 2, its nutritional benefits. Number 3, bonus, is talking about a little bit of misinformation out there about Einkorn. And so I'm going to be upsetting some people, and we'll do that the third one, so you're going to want to stay tuned. Number 4 is what einkorn is used for. And then the 5th one, of course, is how I use einkorn in my kitchen, some tips and tricks, some ideas for you to do this month. But first of all, be sure to comment below. Let me know what your experience with einkorn is. Love it, hate it, excited to try it, crazy expensive, I understand. Let me know in the comments below. Okay, so first up, a general overview and history of einkorn. So a very fun fact about einkorn, and one thing that is definitely you see a lot if you go to purchase einkorn, is that it is considered man's original wheat. Yes, it is the oldest version of wheat that we have available. Einkorn and emmer is believed to be the original wheats that were consumed and domesticated by humankind. So with that being said, I'm sure you can figure it out if you know your history, where it's from. It's generally from the Fertile Crescent, and it grows wild still to this day, predominantly in Turkey. So basically what we can tell through archaeology, and it's been kind of confirmed, is there is wild einkorn and then there's domesticated einkorn, which leads to the fact that einkorn is actually not really, hasn't really been messed with through all of these thousands of years, and we'll explain why in just a minute, but it generally has not been hybridized. It is one of the original, like pretty much what we have now is extremely close to the wild einkorn that they have, and based on they trace back DNA and all the things to show that it is basically the original wheat. Unlike whenever you go over to say Spelt, which is technically a hybrid, and same thing with emmer, those are technically hybridized because it is the wild wheat that has been hybridized with a wild goat grass. So now does that make einkorn more superior? Not necessarily, and we will get to that in point number 3. Now, the main difference between the wild einkorn and the domesticated einkorn really comes down to the seed heads. Wild einkorn, whenever the seed heads fall off, they burst, thus allowing the seeds to be distributed so they will grow. It's how God designed it to be. Domesticated einkorn, humans basically domesticated it where those seed heads are a bit tighter. So if it does fall, we don't lose the grain. The wheat actually has to be threshed out or like beaten, things like that. So it was actually easier for man to harvest and to grow. That's why it became a bit more domesticated. And again, this was just traits that they were able to work out all on their own, no laboratory needed. Domesticated einkorn seeds are a little bit larger than the wild version, which is pretty normal anytime you domesticate anything. And then also the thing with domesticated einkorn is it does require humanity or man to keep it alive, because as I stated, those seeds are not going to really come apart from that hard husk. And if that doesn't happen, that means the seeds are not planted and the plant will not survive. So as I mentioned, that it is seen as the only wheat that has never truly been hybridized. And if you're wondering how in the world that can happen over thousands of years, because if you've watched other videos where I talk about the difference between genetically modified and hybridization, hybridization happens naturally. Like it can happen all on its own. It's how God designed plants, animals, humans to survive throughout all these different changing environments. The main reason that it hasn't been hybridized is because einkorn kind of self-pollinates. It does not pollinate very rapidly or quickly with others. It just pollinates itself, which leads to just not needing to really be hybridized. So as I mentioned, definitely traces back to the Fertile Crescent, which is generally what we know is where humanity began. And from the Fertile Crescent, it then spread into the Caucasus, the Balkans, and then to Central Europe, and is commonly grown in cooler climates. Now, it did start to decline in favor of emmer wheat, which was easier to harvest, to separate the husk from the seed, all of that. So even back in ancient Egypt, we do see that ancient Egyptians actually were preferring to grow emmer. And so it just started to kind of die off in favor of other grains like emmer and spelt, eventually durum, those type of grains, but it was still being grown into the 20th century and definitely through medieval times into the 20th century, but it just wasn't very popular. And a fun fact about einkorn, and you've probably heard this story before if you've tried to look and purchase einkorn, find out all about it, is that it actually was confirmed of how ancient of a grain that is and how close it is to the original einkorn that it was thousands of years ago, because back in 1991, some hikers were in the northern Italian Alps and they discovered a dead man, a frozen iceman sticking out of a glacier that was melting. They have named him Otzi, the Iceman. I hope that's how you pronounce it, based on just the region where he was from. And lo and behold, he actually had undigested food in his mouth, and it consisted of ibex meat, roots, berries, and einkorn. Which I would like to point out that this proves that we have been eating meat, grains, fruits and vegetables, those type of things all together for a very long time. So take that, carnivore only people. Now, it's actually harder to nail down who actually are the top producers of einkorn because it's still not grown a lot. It is more difficult to grow, to harvest, so just not as many people, not as many farmers are growing it. But you can find it here in the United States, in Canada, you can also find in Italy. And in fact, it became popular again thanks to Jovial Foods, who you may have heard of, who's done a lot of work to actually help bring back the popularity of einkorn as a really great wheat to consume. And that's why einkorn typically is probably the most expensive grain to buy. It's just a simple matter of supply and demand. The fact that the supply just isn't that high, but the demand is pretty popular, but just because there's just not as much supply, that's why einkorn, when you look at the pricing, might give you a mild heart attack. But many thanks to Jovial Foods and all the work that they have done. Carla has done a lot of work. I know that she has since passed away, but I think it is because of her and other people who've really brought back the popularity of einkorn, which is why I think we have more of it in supply today. Okay, so number 2, the nutritional benefits of einkorn. Y'all, it's a whole grain, okay? And if you've been around for a bit, you know that we generally have the same great and wonderful uses, nutritional benefits that comes from whole grains. And that includes high amounts of fiber. You also have great amounts of iron and potassium and magnesium and phosphorus. You also have your wonderful B vitamins, vitamin E, all of those delicious goodness. Very, very similar with whole grains, a lot of those. But einkorn actually shines in a couple of areas. And one nutrient that einkorn actually has a bit more of is a word that I'm probably about to butcher because it's the carotenoids. Carotenoids? Basically what that is they're antioxidants that give fruits and vegetables that red, yellow, and orange color. Specifically, it is very high in lutein, which is an antioxidant actually found in your eye, and it actually is known to protect your retina from damage and aging. Now, you will see that it actually is higher in protein, but this does not necessarily translate to the ability to produce good gluten in order to form really great high, tall yeast spreads. So just know, in case you didn't know, no grains have gluten. Nothing has gluten. Gluten is formed based on proteins in these wheats and grains that contain it. So little minor technicality there. So basically it does have the proteins that do make gluten like all wheats do, but the type of proteins that it has does not produce strong enough gluten for your typical really high yeast spreads. And we'll be talking about how to be using einkorn and the challenges that come with it later, but this does lead to number 3. The big one. We're going to be talking about some misinformation out there about einkorn that I have found that kind of irritates me a little bit as someone who focuses solely on whole grains. We need to clear some things up, okay, y'all? So buckle up, buttercup, and pay attention. The biggest thing is the fact that when you go out there, and all my research with einkorn in preparation for this video is everyone talks about how einkorn is superior. It is an ancient grain, it is man's original wheat, and it is far superior than our modern wheats, and how people are able to consume einkorn and are not able to handle our modern wheats. The problem with this is pretty much everyone would just lump in our modern wheat, and no one was actually distinguishing if we're talking about the flour or if we're talking about the wheat in itself. Absolutely, I 100% agree that white flour is bad. White flour that we are consuming nowadays, doesn't matter what wheat or grain it is from. When you highly refine a grain and you're taking out the bran and the germ and all of the beneficial nutrients that God put in there to help you digest it, then yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all that you have issues with it. And that doesn't matter if that is our modern hard red, hard white wheat, or if it is an ancient grain. If you take out those nutrients that God put in to help your body handle this grain, it doesn't surprise me at all that you have problems. And most people are never talking about that. I never saw anyone actually distinguish between true whole grains and einkorn. Let's compare apples to apples. Let's compare milling hard red wheat, which is a modern wheat, to milling einkorn wheat as an ancient grain. And let's see how it works. For most people, with the many testimonies that I've received, many people who have gluten sensitivities, gluten intolerance, they are not able to handle your typical store-bought bread, dead flour from the store. Not surprising. But many of these people who have these sensitivities have been able to go straight to milling their own grains, even with our modern wheats, and not have any issues with it. So it's just a very annoying thing. It's how misinformation gets out there. People thinking that, oh, if I buy all-purpose einkorn flour, then I'm going to be totally fine and okay. And this is better than the white flour. And yeah, it probably is better than the white flour, but that doesn't mean that a modern wheat is bad. It's bad if you're refining it, not if you're milling it whole. Another big argument that they use to state that einkorn is superior is the fact that it has 14 chromosomes as opposed to modern wheat containing 42 chromosomes. Now, I am not a geneticist, and if there is a geneticist, please enlighten us in the comments below, because this information has been hard for me to nail down. Like, what exactly does that mean? Is that necessarily, and I do not believe that that necessarily means something is bad. Now, I do know enough to know that, say in humans, if you have one extra chromosome, like that chromosome, I think it's 21, that can produce Down syndrome. So I do understand that when you mess with the chromosomes, that can certainly result in some sort of deficiency, deformity, something going on. I do understand that, but I do not believe that that's necessarily the case when it comes to wheat. Just because einkorn has 14 chromosomes and our modern wheat has 42 chromosomes, I don't really see where that's necessarily a bad thing, because our modern wheat is still wheat. It's not deformed. It still contains the B vitamins, the vitamin E, like all of these things. It has been hybridized by man, not genetically modified. Well, kind of has. See this video here, but Brazil. So all that I know is I did do this type of research where let's compare it to modern apples have 17 chromosomes, but geneticists traced back the ancestor to apples having 9 chromosomes. And no one's talking about how modern apples are absolutely horrible and are causing all of these problems. So I do not think that argument is valid. Again, I have really tried to research this out. If any of you actually know more about genetics than I do, feel free to comment down below what this means. But from what I can tell, I do not think that that is a strong and valid argument of why einkorn is superior than our modern wheat, just based on how many chromosomes that it has. But I'm open to being told otherwise. Another bit of misinformation that can be a bit misleading out there is the fact that they state that einkorn has never been hybridized. This is not necessarily a bad thing that it's never been hybridized, but hybridization in and of itself, as I mentioned earlier, is not a bad thing. God designed for plants, animals, and even humans to be able to hybridize so we can adapt to our environment. The world today is not how God created it back in the Garden of Eden. This world is not even like it was when Noah stepped off the flood, which was another drastic change from the pre-flood world. And again, y'all, I'm a Bible believer, so I do believe the Bible. That is our history and is 100% accurate. So for those of you who do not believe this, then yeah, then this is not really going to matter to you maybe. But I think even you can agree that the world is not the same as it was thousands of years ago. However many years you think this world is, the world is not. The world has changed. the fact that, I mean, look at how many colors that we have, that humanity has, the different hair types that we have. I mean, there's so much variety, and that is all just hybridization. And it happens. Same thing with our plants and animals. Bananas today aren't what they used to be. Apples today aren't what they used to be. Same thing with I mean, everything is fine. Our cows are hybridized. It's just a way for things to survive. Mankind, humanity has been doing it to get traits that we like. So just to state that something has never been hybridized does not mean that it is superior or better. Maybe in some small way it is, but overall, let's remember hybridization is not a bad and evil thing. Another huge piece of misinformation out there is they state, and I have to look at my notes, Einkorn wheat berries are smaller than modern wheat because modern wheat is bred to produce more gluten. I actually did read this in Carla Bartolucci, the founder of Jovial Foods, in her Einkorn cookbook. And I'll go ahead and tell you, just from my experience with grains, this is actually not true. Einkorn wheat is small. But you know what other wheat is actually larger than that? That is Kamut. Kamut, I would say, is actually the largest of the wheat berries, and that is an ancient grain. Kamut and Corzon, they are significantly larger than Einkorn and even our modern wheats. So that's just completely false to say that because, you know, a grain is smaller than other grains means that it's better. That's just it's just wrong, because again, Kamut is a very ancient grain, but it's the largest. And I would say that Einkorn is actually roughly the same size as, say, some of my soft white wheat berries. You know, it is smaller, but there are also other grains that are smaller than that. And yeah, so that's just not correct. Sorry, no offense, just not correct. Now, as far as it producing, modern wheats producing more gluten than Einkorn, as I stated, no wheats have gluten. They have proteins that come together that produce gluten. And there is something to this where Einkorn does not produce the same type of gluten as like our hard red or hard white, even Spelt, those type of grains. That doesn't make it more superior necessarily. And in fact, in Sue Becker's book, Home Milling Guide, I can't remember the name right now. It's this one up here. I'll link it below. But she states in her book that no scientists have there are no research studies out there to actually show that the different wheats producing the amount of gluten that they do actually react different ways with human beings. So in other words, I think if you're milling your own wheat, you're consuming it whole, then it doesn't matter the different types, how the gluten comes out, you should be fine. It's not the types of gluten that comes out. Yeah, I know this sounds really weird, but it leads to the next one where they also state that Einkorn does not have the D chromosome, which seems to be connected with wheat intolerance in many humans. So again, that probably is true that Einkorn does not have this D chromosome. I am unsure if this one has truly been linked with wheat intolerance because, again, they are not comparing apples to apples. They are just stating this, but not actually talking about, okay, well, what if you mill it yourself? What if you mill modern wheat that has the D chromosome? Like, maybe that's why people are having issues, because they're consuming white flour instead of whole grains. Again, I want to say all of this to say that if you are truly a celiac, if you have true celiacs, none of this applies to you, because you cannot have Einkorn anyway, because you cannot have any grain that has gluten in it, period. Doesn't matter if it's ancient, modern, or well in between. So just know, for all my celiacs out there, I'm not talking to you, but considering that is less than 1% of the population right now, most likely I'm not talking to you. Okay, so that's just kind of the misinformation out there. I hope this all kind of makes sense. But bottom line, I think the biggest thing that we need to understand is we need to separate out the difference of what it means to be milling your grains yourself, consuming whole wheat, actually true whole grain, whether it's modern wheat or ancient wheat. You should be milling all of your wheats and all of your grains to make flour. And not be consuming just regular all-purpose flour where the nutrients are lost. And that is the thing that I want to leave you with, is just be milling grains yourself. Now, number 4, what is Einkorn used for? Nothing special with this, because it's used for food. Baking pasta, breads, eaten whole. So there's really no other uses, like with other grains where they may be used in the pharmaceutical world or animal feed, things like that. Einkorn is just for us to eat. Yay. All right, so let's talk about how to be using einkorn in your kitchen. And I'm really excited to be experimenting more with this grain because I haven't used it a lot in my kitchen. But let me tell you about the experience that I have. First of all, einkorn, like kamut, is tricky to work with. It is very, very sticky. It can be very, very tacky. It absorbs oils and waters and fats differently than your typical wheats. I do not recommend this grain right off for beginners, especially milling it whole. But in saying that, I actually do recommend this book. Now, the information she gives at the beginning, I've kind of tabbed it where some of that misinformation I talked about, she does talk about it in here, and I disagree. But I do recommend this book. I will be working with some recipes here because she does give helpful information dealing with einkorn, both whole grain or the all-purpose einkorn flour. And the biggest thing is I do recommend that you take the time to read the introduction where she's telling you how einkorn works. And she specifically talks about the difference between whole grain einkorn and all-purpose einkorn, so you know how to adjust the recipes. But I will definitely be going through this and using it. But I have already been using it in my kitchen, and some things that I've noticed is they make delicious rolls, very, very tacky and sticky and kind of difficult to work with, but super soft. And my husband even states that they are very close, almost like a sourdough flavor, just all on its own. I just use my regular roll recipe. I just used einkorn, but it's such a, it's a delicious nutty flavor. It's a wonderful, wonderful flavor that almost is very close to a sourdough type flavor. I've also used it making gravy for Thanksgiving. I made my gravy with it, and I noticed that because einkorn mills very, very fine, it mills very fine all on its own. And so with that, it incorporated into my gravy very, very well. Usually whenever I'm using like other wheats for my gravy, I can always like kind of see that bran and germ in there, or it's just a little speckled. Not a big deal. It still tastes delicious. But in this, you couldn't tell at all. You would have thought I used all-purpose flour because it was just so smooth. So it definitely did excellent in my gravies. But the biggest thing is that it is very tacky and sticky and needs some adjustments when working with your recipes. So again, I do recommend this. You can substitute one for one pretty much, but there may need to be adjustments with the liquids and with the fats. So I will be linking this book below, and I'm hoping to shoot a video of me testing some recipes out because I'm really excited. So there you go, y'all. Einkorn, the final grain for our Grains Explorer Challenge, and I'm so excited that you've been with me throughout this whole challenge. And let me know again below what your experience with einkorn is, if you love it and you hate it. I will also link below where to find this grain because not everyone carries it. Thank you so very much for following me on this Grains Explorer Challenge. My grainies, I love you. Look for those extra recipes in your member portal, and grainsandgrit.com/grainsexplorer is where you need to go to learn all about this Grains Explorer Challenge. And if you need to catch up on all the grains that we have, then be sure to check out this playlist right here to catch up on all the grains that you have missed. As always, I hope you'll have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next week. Bye. All right, you made it. You made it. Congratulations, and thank you so much for making it until the end. I know that was probably a lot of information and no way that you could absorb it all in one setting, but that's the beauty of grains. And this is only 12 of them. There are so many more grains out there that we didn't cover. My goal for 2024 and with this challenge was to kind of get grains that maybe people were less familiar with, and also to get out of our comfort zone of our typical hard red, hard white, soft white wheats, those type of things, and help people to understand these grains better and how to use them in their kitchen. So again, let me know what you learned in the comments below, and thank you so much for sticking to the end. And if you really like these marathon videos, and maybe now you just need some inspiration for getting all the baking and cooking done in your home, no problem. I got another big marathon bake with me video that you can certainly check out here. Just turn it on and cook and bake along with me in your kitchen. As always, I hope that this video was helpful, and y'all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next week. Bye.